Picture this. You're standing in the great hall of a 14th century castle, and somewhere in the stone corridors above a brass bell begins to ring. Not the frantic clang of an alarm, this is slow, deliberate, almost mournful. 3 measured strikes that echo off tapestries depicting your ancestors slaying various creatures. That sound. It's not calling you to prayer or warning of invasion. It's announcing that you noble lord or lady of this draughty fortress are about to begin the most choreographed, absurd, and occasionally disturbing process of going to bed that humanity has ever devised. You probably won't survive this without laughing at least once, because what's about to unfold over the next 2 hours isn't just getting ready for sleep. It's a theatrical production involving dozens of people, religious artifacts, heated stones, suspicious foods, and a level of paranoia about demons that would make a modern security system look relaxed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'm genuinely curious how many of you are trying to fall asleep at 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. No judgment. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The night bell, that's what they called it in most noble households from roughly 1300 onward. The term appears in the household account books from French, English and German castles, usually buried between entries for wine for the chaplain and replacement hinges for the torture chamber door. Historians still argue whether the bell was meant to signal the household, or simply to give you the noble enough warning to finish whatever you were doing in the Great Hall, usually arguing about taxes or pretending to read Latin. When that bell rings, you don't just stand up and wander to your chambers. Oh no. Standing near the doorway is your master of the household, a man whose entire existence revolves around making sure you don't accidentally die, get poisoned, or embarrass the family name by doing something as reckless as putting on your own nightshirt. He's been waiting for this moment since sunset. He's got a wax tablet with tonight's schedule, and he's checking it twice, which is ironic, because literacy rates among servants were roughly 12%. But this guy can tell time by candle mark like he's got a Rolex grafted to his brain. You make eye contact. He nods. The procession begins. And yes, I said procession, because you're not walking to your bedroom alone. That would be dangerous, undignified, possibly heretical depending on which bishop you ask. Instead, you're joined by approximately 8 to 15 people, whose jobs tonight involve making sure you successfully lie down without incident. There's the chamberlain 2 pages, the wardrobe keeper, a chaplain, your personal cupbearer, who definitely isn't still drunk from dinner, and at least 3 servants whose specific roles you've never quite understood, but who've been following you around since you were baptized. The route from Great Hall to bedchamber isn't direct. This castle was built by your great-great-grandfather, a man who apparently designed floor plans while heavily concussed. You're walking through corridors that turn at 45-degree angles for no reason past arrow slits that let in drafts cold enough to frost your eyebrows under doorways so low that the tallest page has to duck. Torches line the walls, real flames, real smoke, real risk of your velvet sleeve catching fire if you brush too close. One servant walks ahead with a candle lantern not because you can't see where you're going, but because symbolism matters. Light leading you through darkness. Very metaphorical. Very expensive given how much beeswax costs. You pass the chapel. The chaplain in your entourage makes the sign of the cross. You make the sign of the cross. Everyone makes the sign of the cross except the 12-year-old page, who's clearly thinking about literally anything else. A side door opens and your wife's procession merges with yours. She's been dining in her solo with her ladies, and now both groups converge like medieval traffic at a roundabout. 16 people, 1 hallway, 0 personal space. Finally, you reach the door to your chamber. It's already open. It's been open since sunset because someone, probably the firekeeper, has been inside for the past hour, preparing the space which apparently requires the door to be ajar so spirits can escape. Yes, spirits. We'll get to that later, and trust me, it gets weirder. The chamberlain steps through first, carrying a small silver rod. Historians still argue whether this rod had religious significance, or was just a fancy stick to poke the corner of the room, checking for assassins hiding behind the curtains. He does a lap of the chamber, muttering something in Latin that definitely isn't a prayer you learned in church. Then he turns, nods, and steps aside. You enter your bedroom. The ritual has begun. You'd think that medieval nobles were allergic to water, wouldn't you? Pop culture has done an excellent job convincing everyone that people in the Middle Ages bathed approximately twice in their lifetimes. Once at birth, once at marriage, and only then if the priest insisted. But here's the thing that makes historians pull their hair out: wealthy nobles bathed before bed far more often than you'd expect, and the process was so elaborate it required its own wing of the castle. Not every night, mind you, let's not get crazy. But several times a week, particularly in larger castle households from the 13th century, onward bathing was part of the bedtime ritual. We know this because household accounts meticulously recorded the cost of heating water, purchasing soap, and replacing the wooden tubs that kept splitting from the temperature changes. One account from a French castle in 1387 lists expenditures for rosewater for the ladies' evening bath, right next to hay for the horses and ale for the executioner, which really makes you wonder what kind of week they were having. So you're standing in your bedchamber and the chamberlain gestures toward a side door you might not have noticed before. It leads to a smaller room, not exactly a bathroom in the modern sense, more like a stone closet, with a drain hole in the floor and hooks on the walls for hanging your dignity. Inside there's a wooden tub roughly the size of a modern bathtub but shaped like a wine barrel that's been sawed in half. It's lined with linen cloth to protect your noble skin from splinters, because apparently your great-grandfather learned that lesson the hard way. The water is already steaming. 4 servants have been hauling buckets up 3 flights of stairs for the past 20 minutes, heating each load over the kitchen fire, then speed walking through corridors while the water cools from boiling to merely scalding. They've timed this precisely so that by the time you arrive the temperature is exactly right, which is to say slightly too hot because you'll complain if it's cold, and servants have long memories. But here's where it gets interesting. The water isn't just water. Oh no, that would be far too simple, too peasant-like. Your bath has been infused with herbs, flowers and substances that medical treatises of the era promised would balance the humours and fortify the night vapours from entering through the skin. We're talking rose petals, chamomile lavender if you're fancy, and you are mint, leaves, sage, and occasionally some truly baffling additions like crushed hazelnuts or wine. Yes, wine. Some nobles bathed in diluted wine before bed, because a 13th century physician named Bernard de Gordon claimed it prevented nightmares. Historians still argue whether this actually worked or just made the bathroom smell like a tavern floor. The servants don't leave. Privacy, as we've established, hasn't been invented yet. 2 of them kneel beside the tub with scrubbing cloths made of rough linen, think somewhere between a washcloth and sandpaper. They're going to wash you whether you like it or not, because doing it yourself would be undignified. You're a noble. Nobles don't wash themselves. That's like expecting a king to saddle his own horse or a duchess to know where the kitchen is. You step into the tub, which involves a small wooden stool and more assistance than seems physically necessary. The water engulfs you up to your chest, and immediately one servant begins scrubbing your back with the enthusiasm of someone cleaning a castle wall. It's not gentle. Medieval hygiene was more aggressive exfoliation than spa experience. Meanwhile, another servant is washing your hair with a mixture of lye soap and ashes, which sounds horrifying, but actually worked reasonably well at removing the layers of grease and smoke residue that accumulated from spending your day near open fires and torchlit halls. Your scalp is tingling, possibly burning, probably both. Here's a quirky detail that shows up in several household records. Some nobles requested that their bathwater be blessed before use. Not just herbs thrown in, but an actual chaplain coming to the bathing chamber and murmuring prayers over the tub while you sit there naked and dripping. The reasoning water was considered a dangerous liminal substance. It touched your body. It could carry demons, and without God's protection, you might absorb evil through your pores. This sounds absurd until you remember that these same people believed the position of Venus could give you indigestion, so really blessed bathwater was pretty reasonable by comparison. The servants are now pouring warm water over your head to rinse out the soap ash mixture. It runs down your face, tastes like the inside of a fireplace, and makes your eyes water. You endure it because complaining would be admitting that a peasant's scrubbing technique is too rough for you, and you've got a reputation to maintain. After roughly 15 minutes, which feels like 40, you're helped out of the tub and immediately wrapped in heated linen cloths. Yes, heated. There's a servant whose entire job tonight was to warm these sheets near the fire so that the transition from hot bath to cold air doesn't send you into shock. You stand there steaming like a dumpling, while 2 more servants pat you dry with the intensity of people who've been threatened with punishment if you catch a chill. One record from an English manor in 1441 mentions a noble who insisted on being bathed twice before bed, once with herbs, once with just warm water, because he believed the second bath washed away the dreams that clung to him from the night before. Historians still argue whether he was superstitious or just really enjoyed baths, but either way, his servants probably hated him. You're dry now, mostly. Your skin smells like a monastery garden. Your hair is damp and will stay that way until morning because hairdryers won't exist for another 5 centuries. The servants wrap you in a loose linen robe, not your sleeping clothes, those come later, and guide you back into the main bedchamber. The bathing ritual is complete. You're clean blessed, and thoroughly manhandled by people you pay to touch you. Onward. You're standing in the middle of your bedchamber wrapped in heated linen like an expensive burrito, and you might think the hard part is over. You bathed. You're clean. Surely now you can just put on some pajamas and call it a night right wrong, so wonderfully, absurdly wrong. Because what comes next is a process so elaborate, so meticulously choreographed, that it makes modern airport security look casual. Welcome to the undressing ceremony, which is actually a misnomer because you're technically already undressed. This is more accurately the removing your day clothes that you put back on after the bath for reasons no one can adequately explain ceremony, and it requires an average 6 to 12 people, depending on how many layers you wore today and how anxious your family is about assassinations. The servants line up in a sequence that was established decades ago and has been passed down like a sacred text. First comes the wardrobe keeper. A woman, usually a woman, though some households employed men for this role, whose entire existence revolves around your clothing. She knows every garment you own, where it's stored, how many times it's been worn, and probably what you were doing the last time you wore it. She's holding a wooden pole with a hook on the end, which sounds medieval and threatening, because it is both of those things. She approaches you with the reverence of someone approaching a religious icon. Your outer robe, the one you threw on after your bath, is carefully lifted off your shoulders by 2 attendants who've positioned themselves on either side of you like flanking guards. They don't pull, that would be barbaric. They lift slowly while you stand there with your arms slightly raised, trying to look dignified, and not at all like a toddler being changed. The robe is passed to another servant who folds it with geometric precision and places it on a chest specifically designated for garments worn between bath and bed. Yes, that's a real category. Medieval nobles had furniture for clothes they wore for 20 minutes. Now you're in your undertunic, which is basically a long linen shirt that goes down to your knees. But this too must be removed because sleeping in your day undertunic would be unhygienic, and we can't have that not after you just bathed in rose-scented wine water. 2 more servants step forward. One unlaces the ties at your neck. There are approximately 47 knots, or at least it feels that way, while another servant kneels at your feet ready to catch the garment when it drops. Here's where it gets weird, and I mean, historians have written entire papers about this. Weird, you don't pull your own undertunic over your head. That would be work. Instead, you raise your arms like you're surrendering to an invisible army, and the servants perform a synchronized lift and pull maneuver that would make Olympic synchronized swimmers jealous. The undertunic comes off in one smooth motion, and for exactly 3 seconds you're standing completely naked in a room with a dozen people. No one looks at you. Not directly. It's considered deeply inappropriate to make eye contact with a naked noble, unless you're the physician or the spouse, and even then it's complicated. The servants have perfected the art of staring at the middle distance, their eyes focused on some point just past your left shoulder, as if by not looking directly they can pretend you're not naked, and they're not participating in this increasingly absurd theatre. Your night shift, the actual garment you'll sleep in, is already being held aloft by 2 more servants. It's made of linen softer than your day clothes, and it's been warmed by the fire for the past 10 minutes, so that the fabric doesn't shock your clean, damp skin. The servants lower it over your head like they're crowning you with textile. Your arms go through the sleeves guided by hands you can't see because the fabric is currently over your face. There's a moment of claustrophobic darkness, and then your head emerges, and you're dressed. But wait, there's more. If you're a married noblewoman, there's a high probability that your night shift has been inspected earlier in the evening by your senior lady-in-waiting who check for loose thread stains and this is documented in several household records, signs of witchcraft in the weave. Apparently, some families believed that enemies could curse a noble through their nightclothes, so every garment had to be examined for irregularities. Historians still argue whether this was genuine paranoia, or just an excuse to employ more servants, but either way someone got paid to stare at your pyjamas looking for hexes. Now comes the layering. Because one night shift isn't enough, not in a castle where the interior temperature hovers somewhere between refrigerator and crypt. A second servant approaches with a heavier robe, usually wool or thick linen lined with fur if you're particularly wealthy. This goes over the night shift. Then come the sleeves, separate sleeves that tie onto the robe at the shoulders because medieval clothing was modular in ways that make IKEA furniture look straightforward. Each sleeve is tied by a different servant, both working simultaneously, pulling the laces tight enough to stay but loose enough that you won't lose circulation. Your legs aren't forgotten. Another servant kneels with woolen hose, basically very long socks that go up to your thighs, and rolls them onto your feet and calves with the care of someone defusing a bomb. These are secured with garters made of cloth tied just below the knee. If you're a man, you might also get a pair of soft leather slippers. If you're a woman, you're probably going barefoot because apparently female feet were considered less susceptible to cold, which is nonsense, but medieval medicine was nothing if not confidently incorrect. One account from a Burgundian castle in 1460 describes a noble who required his servants to clap 3 times before touching any garment supposedly to wake the fabric from the day's spirits. His household staff thought he was insane, but they clapped anyway because employment is employment. You're fully dressed now, warm, layered, surrounded by people who've just spent 15 minutes clothing you like you're a large, wealthy doll. The parade continues. You're dressed, you're warm, and you're probably thinking that surely you can now approach your actual bed and begin the process of lying down. But no, not yet. Because before you can touch a single pillow, before your noble body can make contact with sheets and blankets, those linens must be blessed. Not metaphorically blessed like, oh, these are nice sheets, bless them. Actually blessed by an actual priest, with actual holy water, because medieval nobles were convinced that fabric was a gateway for demons, And honestly, given how many people died of mysterious illnesses in beds, maybe they were onto something. The chaplain who's been following you since the Great Hall now steps forward, and he's carrying what looks like a tiny bucket and a brush that resembles something you'd use to baste a turkey. This is his aspergillum, the holy water sprinkler, and he's about to use it with the seriousness of a man performing battlefield surgery. He approaches your bed, which is a massive wooden structure that probably cost more than a peasant would earn in 15 lifetimes, draped with curtains thick enough to block out reality itself. But before he begins, 2 servants pull back the bed curtains and strip away the top layer of coverings. Not all of them, that would take too long, just the outermost blanket and the pillows. These are laid out on a nearby bench in a specific order, because apparently even textile arrangement has rules that must not be violated lest chaos reign. The chaplain dips his brush into the holy water and begins flicking droplets onto the sheets. Not soaking them, just a light misting like he's trying to water a very holy garden. He mutters prayers in Latin as he works, moving from one corner of the bed to the next, in a pattern that forms a cross if you were to map his movements from above. This takes approximately 5 minutes, which doesn't sound like much until you're standing there in your wool nightrobe, still slightly damp from your bath, watching a man sprinkle water on your bed, while 12 other people watch him do it. The prayers vary by household and region, but a common one recorded in several 15th century household manuals goes something like this: Benedic Domini hoc cubile et omnes habitant in eo. Bless, O Lord, this bed and all who dwell in it. Some versions add additional lines about protection from nocturnalis demonibus, which translates to night demons, because apparently daytime demons were less of a concern. Historians still argue whether nobles genuinely believed demons specifically waited until bedtime to attack, or if this was just a comforting ritual that helped people sleep in castles where every shadow looked like a person and every draught sounded like breathing. Once the bed frame and sheets are blessed, the chaplain moves to the pillows. Each one gets its own sprinkle and its own murmured prayer. If you're particularly devout or particularly paranoid, you might have requested that your pillows be stuffed with herbs considered holy or protective: lavender for purity, rosemary for memory, mugwort to prevent nightmares. One German household record from 1423 mentions a noblewoman who insisted her pillows contained threads from a priest's vestment sewn into the fabric where her head would rest because she believed it would give her visions of saints. Whether it worked is not recorded, but her embroidery bills were astronomical. The blankets come next. These are the real challenge, because medieval beds weren't just covered with one quilt. Oh no, you've got layers. The bottom layer is usually linen sheets, followed by wool blankets, often multiple wool blankets, then fur coverings if you're wealthy enough, and finally a top coverlet made of silk or embroidered fabric that's more decorative than functional. Each layer must be blessed individually, which means the chaplain is now flicking holy water onto what amounts to a textile lasagna. Here's a quirky detail that appears in several English household accounts. Some families required that the blessing be performed in a specific direction. Not just any cross pattern would do it. Had to start from the head of the bed and move toward the foot, never the reverse. Because moving from a foot to head was considered inviting spirits to climb upward toward the sleeper's soul. This meant that if the chaplain made a mistake and blessed in the wrong direction, he had to start over. Imagine being that chaplain. Imagine the performance anxiety. While this is happening, another servant, usually the most junior one, the one who gets all the weird jobs, is blessing the bed curtains. Yes, the curtains. These heavy fabric drapes that hang around your bed to create a private sleeping chamber within your sleeping chamber also require holy protection. The servant uses a smaller aspergillum, basically a miniature version of what the chaplain has, and dabs holy water along the seams and edges. This isn't considered as spiritually important as blessing the actual bed, so it can be done by someone less ordained, but it's still taken seriously. One French manual from 1380 specifies that curtain blessing must be done with reverence and not haste, which suggests that at some point someone tried to speed run this process and got reprimanded. Now here's where the historical record gets genuinely strange. Some households didn't just bless the linens once per night. If you got up in the middle of the night to use the chamber pot, and we'll get to that, and then return to bed, certain families believed the linens needed to be re-blessed because you'd broken the sacred seal by leaving. This meant keeping a small vial of holy water on your bedside table, along with a servant who stayed awake specifically to resprinkle your sheets if necessary. Historians still argue whether this was common practice or just a few extremely anxious noble families taking things too far, but the fact that it's mentioned in multiple sources suggests it happened more than once. The blessing is complete. Your bed is now spiritually fortified against evil demons, nightmares, and probably poor sleep posture. The chaplain steps back, makes the sign of the cross one final time, and exits the chamber. He's done his job. Your linens are holy. The servants begin replacing the blankets and pillows in their proper positions, smoothing out wrinkles with the intensity of people who know they'll be blamed if you wake up uncomfortable. You stand there watching fabric get arranged, wondering if perhaps your ancestors took bedtime a bit too seriously. But you don't say this out loud because heresy accusations start with comments exactly like that. You might think that your hair, having already been washed during the bath, would be fine. Just leave it alone, let it dry, go to bed. But you would be thinking like a reasonable person, and reasonable people did not design medieval noble bedtime rituals. Your hair is about to become the focus of an entire sub-ceremony that will take anywhere from 30 minutes to a full hour, depending on how long your hair is and how many superstitions your household subscribes to. A servant appears, usually a woman, often the same one who's been attending to your hair since you were old enough to grow it past your ears. She's carrying a wooden tray loaded with tools that look like a mixture of grooming supplies and torture implements. There's a comb made of bone or ivory, a brush with boar bristles, at least 3 small bottles of oil, a ribbon or 2 some pins, and what appears to be a small knife, though that's hopefully for trimming stray threads and not anything more sinister. You sit on a low stool near the fire, not too close, because remember that whole your velvet sleeve catching fire risk, and the servant positions herself behind you. If you're a noble woman, your hair is probably long, very long, down to your waist or beyond, because cutting it short would be scandalous and possibly a sign of illness, insanity, or worse. If you're a nobleman, your hair is likely shoulder length or longer because fashion is fashion, and even warriors had flowing locks that they absolutely did not wash as often as they should have. The servant begins with the comb, and this is not a gentle process. Medieval combs didn't have rounded teeth like modern ones. They were basically tiny weapons designed to rip through tangles with extreme prejudice. She starts at the ends of your hair and works upward, which is at least the correct technique, but it still feels like someone is attempting to remove your scalp one strand at a time. You wince. She doesn't apologize because this is her job, and your comfort is secondary to getting those knots out before they become permanent. Here's where the ritual aspect kicks in while she combs, she counts, out loud. In some households, the magic number was 100 strokes. In others, it was 300. One particularly obsessive Flemish household record from 1456 mentions a count of 500 strokes per night, which must have taken so long that sunrise was a legitimate concern. Historians still argue whether the counting had religious significance or was just a way to ensure thoroughness. But either way, servants across Europe were standing behind nobles counting to absurd numbers, while their arms went numb. Every 20 strokes or so, she pauses to inspect the comb. She's looking for lice, which were an occupational hazard of medieval living regardless of your social class. If she finds any, and there's a decent chance she will because even castles had hygiene limits, she removes them with a specialised fine-toothed comb and deposits them into a small bowl of vinegar kept nearby for exactly this purpose. The vinegar kills them. Probably, hopefully. Medieval pest control was more optimistic than effective. Once the combing marathon is complete, she picks up the brush and begins the second phase. The brush is softer but still firm, made from boar bristles that are somehow both scratchy and smooth at the same time. She brushes in long flowing strokes from your scalp to the ends of your hair, and this is when the oils come into play. She dips her fingers into one of those little bottles and begins working the oil through your hair section by section. What's in the oil? Great question. The answer varies wildly depending on region wealth and what the household physician recommended. Common ingredients included olive oil, almond oil, rose oil, and sometimes, brace yourself, rendered animal fat mixed with crushed rose petals. Yes, your hair is being treated with what amounts to scented lard. But here's the thing, it actually worked reasonably well at conditioning and adding shine, even if it made your head smell like a perfumed butcher shop. Some oils had specific purposes beyond just grooming. Rosemary oil was believed to strengthen memory and prevent evil thoughts from entering through the scalp. Lavender oil was for calmness and to ward off insects. One truly baffling recipe from a 14th century medical text recommends an oil infused with the crushed shells of 7 snails collected at dawn on a Thursday, which would supposedly prevent your hair from falling out during sleep. Historians remain skeptical about the snails. If you're a woman, the servant is now beginning to braid your hair. Not just one braid that would be too simple. We're talking 2 braids sometimes, 3 occasionally more, depending on current fashion and how much energy she has left. Each braid is woven tightly because loose hair during sleep was considered both improper and dangerous. Loose hair could tangle, could catch on things, could potentially be grabbed by demons who are apparently very interested in noble hairstyles. The braids are tied off with ribbons, and here's another layer of superstition. The colour of the ribbon mattered. White ribbons were for purity and protection. Red ribbons were for vitality and to prevent anemia, because medieval medicine believed that colour symbolism affected your blood. Blue ribbons were fashionable but also associated with the Virgin Mary, so you'd better be pious if you're wearing blue to bed. One household record mentions a noble who rotated ribbon colours throughout the week based on a system so complex it required a written chart. If you're a man, you're not braiding, but you're not off the hook either. Your hair is being tied back or wrapped in a linen cloth to keep it from tangling overnight. Some men wore what amounted to a hairnet made of silk thread, which sounds ridiculous, until you remember that waking up with impossible knots in waist-length hair is even more ridiculous. Now comes the anointing of the scalp. The servant parts your hair into sections and applies oil directly to your skin, massaging it in with her fingertips. This serves multiple purposes. It moisturizes it, supposedly prevents headaches, and according to several medieval medical texts, it creates a protective barrier against night vapors entering through the top of your head. Because apparently your skull was considered a potential entry point for airborne evil. The entire process has taken 45 minutes. Your scalp tingles. Your hair smells like roses and possibly snails. You're braided, oiled, and thoroughly groomed in ways that your distant descendants will find baffling when they read about it centuries later. The servant steps back, examining her work with the critical eye of an artist. She nods. Your hair is ready for sleep, whatever that means. Now we arrive at what is without question one of the most uncomfortable aspects of noble bedtime rituals. And I say uncomfortable, because there's no polite way to discuss the fact that you, a wealthy and powerful noble, are about to use the bathroom in front of an audience, and not just passively in front of them actively with their assistants. Because privacy, as we've established multiple times now, is a concept that medieval Europe treated like an interesting philosophical idea rather than an actual right. Somewhere in your bedchamber, tucked into a corner or behind a wooden screen if you're lucky, sits the guardrobe chair. This is essentially a wooden seat with a hole in it, positioned over either a shaft that drops down into a cesspit below the castle, or in some cases over a removable chamber pot that will need to be emptied later by someone whose life choices you do not envy. The guardrobe chair in wealthy households is often cushioned, yes, cushioned with fabric or leather, because apparently your noble backside requires comfort even during elimination. You approach the guardrobe and immediately a servant steps forward. Not just any servant, this is the groom of the stool, or in some households, the chamber attendant, and their job is about to get very personal. This position existed in royal households throughout Europe, and while the title and specific duties varied, the core responsibility remained the same. They attended to you during your most vulnerable and private moments, which stopped being private the moment they entered the profession. Here's the part that makes modern people's eyes widen in disbelief. The attendant doesn't just stand there. They assist, actively. If you're wearing multiple layers of night robes, they help lift them out of the way. They position the cushion on the seat. They may actually hold your hand for balance as you sit down, because apparently the act of sitting on a toilet chair was considered precarious enough to require support. One English household manual from 1478 specifies that the attendant should offer the hand but not grasp unless grasped first, which suggests there was etiquette even for this. While you're seated conducting your business with as much dignity as one can muster, while someone stands 3 feet away, the attendant is doing several things. First, they're listening. Not to be creepy, well, it is creepy, but it's medically intentional. Medieval physicians were obsessed with digestion and believed that the sound's frequency and even the effort required to use the guardrobe could indicate illness imbalance of humours or demonic interference. The attendant is supposed to mentally note anything unusual to report to the household physician in the morning. "My lord strained tonight" was an actual sentence that actual servants had to say out loud to actual doctors. Some households took this even further. There are records particularly from French noble families in the 14th and 15th centuries of attendants inspecting the contents of the chamber pot after use. Not for fun, though. Historians still argue whether anyone actually enjoyed this job, but because stool examination was considered crucial medical diagnostics. Colour consistency, smell, all of it supposedly revealed information about your health. Too dark meant an excess of black bile. Too pale meant insufficient yellow bile. If it smelled worse than usual, that could indicate everything from dietary imbalance to witchcraft, which is quite a range of possibilities. Now here's a detail that appears in multiple sources and makes absolutely no sense. Until you remember how paranoid nobles were about assassination, in some households the chamber pot attendant was also responsible for ensuring the guardrobe shaft was clear and hadn't been tampered with. There were genuine concerns that enemies might climb up through the cesspit shaft and attack from below while you were vulnerable. This fear wasn't entirely unfounded. There's at least one recorded instance of a castle siege where attackers attempted exactly this, though they didn't get far because, well, climbing up a shaft full of human waste is harder and more disgusting than it sounds. The attendant carries a small basket containing clean linen cloths, medieval toilet paper essentially, and after you've finished they hand you the cloth. You do not wipe yourself. That would be undignified. Instead, the attendant does it, or at least assists in doing it depending on your household's specific protocols and how much autonomy you've managed to negotiate over the years. This is documented in multiple household accounts, often phrased delicately as cleaning services or intimate attendance. But let's not pretend anyone's fooled by the euphemisms. One Burgundian household record from 1441 mentions a noble who rang a small bell when he was finished signalling the attendant to approach with washing materials. The washing involved a basin of water scented with herbs. Lavender was popular, and another cloth for drying. Your hands are washed too, even though you didn't technically touch anything, because ritual cleanliness mattered as much as actual cleanliness. Historians still argue about why nobles tolerated this level of invasion into their privacy. Some suggest it was simply expected if you grew up with servants attending every aspect of your life. Having someone present during bathroom activities wasn't particularly remarkable. Others argue it was a display of wealth and power. Only the truly rich could afford to have someone whose sole job was to watch them poop. There's also the practical angle. Castles were dark, cold, and full of uneven floors. Having someone nearby to prevent you from falling into a cesspit shaft or knocking over a candle was probably smart, even if it was deeply awkward. After you're cleaned, dried, and your robes are rearranged back into proper position, the attendant steps back. If you used a chamber pot rather than a shaft, they place a wooden lid over it immediately, both to contain the smell, and because open containers of waste were believed to attract malevolent spirits. Some households required the attendant to sprinkle the lid with holy water, because why not add religious ritual to this already bizarre experience? You return to the main sleeping area of your chamber. The attendant retreats to their designated corner where they will remain for the rest of the night in case you need to use the garderobe again. And you might, because that wine you drank at dinner is catching up with you, and your bladder doesn't care about your dignity. The chamber pot sits in the corner, lid closed, waiting. You try not to think about it. You've bathed, you've been dressed by a small army, your hair has been braided and blessed, and you've used the bathroom with more witnesses than a royal coronation. Surely now you can finally climb into your sanctified bed and close your eyes. But wait, you're hungry. Not starving, just that mild evening hunger that modern people solve with a quick snack raid on the refrigerator. Except you don't have a refrigerator and quick snack isn't in the medieval noble vocabulary. What you have instead is the bedtime meal, and it comes with its own elaborate security theatre that would make airport TSA look relaxed. A servant enters carrying a tray. On that tray is your evening repast, usually something light by medieval standards, which means it's still more food than a peasant sees in a week. Common options included a small bowl of pottage, some bread, perhaps cheese, candied fruits if you're wealthy, nuts, and almost always a cup of warm spiced wine. This isn't dinner, you already had dinner, that multi-hour feast that ended 3 hours ago. This is a preventative measure, because medieval medical theory held that going to bed on an empty stomach allowed cold humours to dominate your body, leading to nightmares, illness, and possibly death. Better to eat a little something and tip the balance back toward warmth and life. But here's the thing about being a noble with enemies, and you have enemies, everyone in your social class has enemies. You can't just eat food that appears in your chamber without certain precautions. Enter the food taster, a position that has existed in royal and noble households since ancient Rome, and continues well into the Renaissance. This person's job is exactly what it sounds like. They eat some of your food first to make sure it's not poisoned. And if it is poisoned, well, they die instead of you, which is unfortunate for them, but considered an acceptable occupational hazard. The food taster steps forward. In wealthy households, this might be a dedicated professional who does nothing else. In smaller noble families, it's often a trusted servant who's been with the family for years and presumably values their own life enough not to be complicit in an assassination. The taster picks up a small piece of bread from your tray, tears it in half and eats one half while making eye contact with you. This isn't casual snacking. It's a performance designed to reassure you that the bread is safe. He chews slowly, deliberately swallowing with exaggerated throat movements so you can see the food actually going down. Then he waits. Everyone waits. This is the awkward part because poison doesn't always act instantly, and medieval toxicology was more art than science. Fast-acting poisons like arsenic or certain plant extracts might show symptoms within minutes, vomiting, convulsions, frothing at the mouth, the usual. But slower poisons could take hours or even days, rendering the entire tasting ritual somewhat theatrical. Historians still argue whether food tasting actually prevented many poisonings or just made nobles feel safer, but the practice persisted for centuries, so clearly someone thought it was worth the effort. The taster moves to the pottage using a small wooden spoon to take a mouthful. He holds it in his mouth for a moment. Some manuals specify the duration of 3 Ave Marias before swallowing. Then he samples the cheese nibbles a nut, and finally takes a small sip of the spiced wine. Each item gets its own separate tasting because apparently poisoners might selectively contaminate only certain foods, though that seems like a lot of extra work for a murderer. Now here's where it gets genuinely strange, and this detail appears in multiple household records. From the 14th and 15th centuries, some food tasters didn't just swallow the food. They pre-chewed it. Yes, you read that correctly. The taster would chew your food until it was a manageable pulp, then spit it onto a clean plate, and that pre-chewed food was what you ate. The reasoning was twofold. First, it allowed the taster's saliva to interact with potential poisons, theoretically neutralizing some of them or causing faster reactions. Second, pre-chewed food was considered easier to digest, which aligned with medieval medical theories about weak digestion causing illness. Was this common? Historians genuinely don't know. It's mentioned in enough sources to suggest it wasn't just one eccentric family's quirk, but it's also not described as universal practice. Some scholars think it was reserved for elderly or ill nobles whose digestion was considered particularly delicate. Others believe it was a fashion that came and went popular in certain courts and ignored in others. Either way, the image of a grown adult eating food that another adult pre-chewed for them is, let's call it, memorable. After the tasting is complete and the taster shows no signs of immediate poisoning, no trembling, no pallor, no collapsing onto the floor in dramatic agony, the tray is presented to you. You sit on the edge of your bed or on a chair nearby and you eat. Servants hover at a respectful distance, ready to refill your wine cup or bring more bread if you desire it. The meal doesn't take long, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, because this isn't about enjoyment. It's about medical maintenance, humoral balance, and not dying in your sleep from cold vapours. The spiced wine deserves special mention. This wasn't just wine with some cinnamon thrown in. Medieval spiced wine, often called hippocras, or claret, was a complex mixture of wine, honey, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, cardamom, and sometimes grains of paradise, a spice so expensive that using it announced your wealth to anyone within smelling distance. The drink was served warm-heated by plunging a hot iron poker directly into the cup, which gave it a slightly metallic taste that nobles had apparently learned to ignore. This drink was considered medicinal, not just pleasurable. Warm spiced wine before bed was supposed to aid digestion, warm the body, encourage restful sleep, and protect against nightmares. Some recipes included herbs like chamomile or valerian root for additional sedative effects. Essentially, you're drinking medieval NyQuil, except it tastes better and contains alcohol that could strip paint. One particularly paranoid French household in 1467 required that the wine be heated in front of the noble, with the poker coming directly from the fire in the noble's presence to prevent anyone from adulterating the drink during heating. The servant had to demonstrate that the poker came from the fireplace, and nowhere else, by showing his empty hands before and after retrieving it. This level of caution suggests that someone at some point had been poisoned via poker, which raises so many questions that historians prefer not to think about it too hard. You finish your meal, the taster is still standing still alive, which is good news for both of you. The tray is removed, the cup is taken away, and crumbs are brushed from your lap with a soft cloth. Your stomach is full, not stuffed, just pleasantly satisfied, and the warm wine is making your head feel heavy in that pre-sleep way. The food taster bows and retreats. His job is done for tonight, though he'll probably spend the next few hours monitoring his own digestion just in case. You'd think that dogs in a medieval castle just wandered around freely sleeping wherever they collapsed after a long day of hunting or barking at suspicious peasants. and you'd be partially right, many dogs did exactly that, but the dogs that slept in your bedchamber. Those were subject to rules, hierarchies and positioning protocols that would make a modern pet owner's head spin. Because of course they were. This is medieval nobility we're talking about. Even the animals have assigned seating. First, let's establish which dogs we're discussing. Not the working dogs that live in the kennels and smell like wet fur and questionable life choices. Not the kitchen dogs that turn the roasting spits and sleep near the ovens. We're talking about your personal hunting hounds, greyhounds, deerhounds, maybe a couple of Valants if you're particularly fancy, and possibly a small lapdog if you're a noblewoman with opinions about fashion. These are valuable animals, well-bred, well-trained, and worth more than most servants' annual wages. These dogs have been with you all day. They sat beneath your chair during dinner hoping for scraps. They followed you through the castle corridors during the evening. They watched you bathe with the judgmental expression that only dogs can achieve. And now, as you prepare to sleep, they're going to sleep in your chamber too, because leaving them elsewhere would be unthinkable. They're not just pets, they're status symbols, hunting partners, and in some cases the most loyal companions you have, which says something slightly depressing about your human relationships. But where exactly the dogs sleep is a matter of complex protocol that varied by household region and how much your family cared about order. A servant, usually the kennel master or his assistant, enters your chamber leading the dogs on leather leashes. The dogs know this routine. They've been doing it every night for years. They're probably more familiar with the bedtime ritual than you are. The largest hunting hounds, the ones used for deer or boar, are positioned first. These dogs do not sleep on your bed. Absolutely not. That would be inappropriate, unhygienic, and depending on which medieval etiquette manual you consult, possibly sacrilegious. Instead, they're assigned specific locations on the floor. The most common arrangement places the primary hunting hound at the foot of the bed, lying perpendicular to the bed frame, so that anyone approaching from that direction would have to step over or around the dog first. This isn't accidental, it's a security measure. The dog serves as an early warning system, a furry burglar alarm that will bark or growl if anyone unauthorized approaches while you sleep. Secondary hounds are positioned on either side of the bed, usually curled up on thick straw mats or folded blankets that have been placed there specifically for them. One household record from a Scottish castle in 1455 describes the dog bedding as 2 pallets stuffed with rushes positioned at equal distance from the bedposts, which suggests someone took the time to measure and ensure symmetry. Medieval nobles loved symmetry almost as much as they loved not being murdered. Now here's where it gets oddly specific. The dogs are arranged by rank. Yes, dogs had ranks. The most successful hunting dog, the one with the most, kills the best tracking record. The finest bloodline gets the prime sleeping position at the foot of the bed. Lesser dogs get side positions. Young dogs still in training might be relegated to sleeping near the door or by the fireplace, which is still inside the chamber but clearly not as prestigious. One French hunting manual from 1406 actually diagrams proper dog positioning in the noble's chamber, complete with notes about which breeds should never be placed adjacent to each other due to territorial disputes. Historians still argue whether this ranking system was about practicality or just nobles projecting their obsession with hierarchy onto their pets. Probably both. Medieval society was structured in layers of precedence and status, so why wouldn't that extend to the dogs? If you're a noblewoman, there's a good chance you also have a small lapdog, something like a spaniel or a small terrier, and this dog follows different rules entirely. The lapdog is allowed on the bed, not just allowed, expected. This tiny animal sleeps either at your feet under the covers, or more commonly curled up against your side or stomach. The reasoning is partly affection and partly practical. Small dogs generate surprising amounts of heat, and in a chamber where your breath freezes on cold nights, that extra warmth is welcome. One Italian household record from 1478 mentions a noblewoman who had 3 lapdogs that slept in a specific formation, one at her feet, one against her back, and one tucked against her stomach. The record notes that if any dog moved from its assigned position during the night, she would wake up and reposition it, which suggests either impressive dedication to routine or a sleep disorder that no one was equipped to diagnose. The dogs don't just lie down and immediately sleep, by the way. There's a settling period where they circle their spots multiple times, scratch at their bedding, occasionally whine or huff, and generally behave like dogs who are making sure everyone knows they have opinions about their accommodations. The servants wait patiently during this process, because rushing a dog into position is considered bad luck in some households, and also because dogs don't respond well to rushing. Once the dogs are settled, their leashes are removed, except in households where the noble is particularly paranoid about the dogs wandering during the night. In those cases, the dogs might remain on long tethers attached to hooks embedded in the floor near their sleeping positions. This seems cruel to modern sensibilities, but the tethers were loose enough to allow movement and position changes. The real purpose was preventing the dogs from fighting each other in the middle of the night, which apparently happened often enough to warrant prevention measures. Here's a genuinely charming detail from several English household accounts. Some nobles said goodnight to their dogs. Not just a casual good boy, either formal, ritualized farewells. One record describes a lord who petted each hunting hound's head 3 times while saying its name, supposedly to ensure the dog would guard faithfully through the night. Whether this was superstition or just affection is unclear, but either way it's one of the more humanizing moments in these otherwise bizarre rituals. The kennel master exits, leaving the dogs arranged in their assigned positions like pieces on a chessboard. The large hounds are already settling into sleep, their breathing slowing, their eyes closing. The lapdog is probably burrowing under blankets, creating a small warm lump that you'll have to navigate around all night. You look at your hunting hound at the foot of the bed. Its ears are perked up, still alert, still watching the door. It won't fully relax until you do. That's how it's been trained to mirror your vigilance to sleep, only when you sleep to wake when you wake. It's comforting in a way. At least someone in this room is here by choice, and not because employment demands it. You've made it through bathing, blessing, grooming bathroom attendants, snacking, and dog arrangement. Surely there can't be much left between you and actual sleep. But you'd be wrong, because we haven't yet addressed the windows, and in medieval castles, windows are not simple architectural features you can just ignore. They're potential entry points for cold air, bad weather, evil spirits, and according to some particularly creative household beliefs, flying witches, who specifically target sleeping nobles. So yes, the windows require their own ritual, and yes, it's going to be weird. Your bedchamber probably has between 2 and 4 windows depending on the size of the room and when the castle was built. These aren't the large glass panes you're imagining. Glass windows were expensive and relatively rare until the later medieval period. More likely you're looking at narrow openings with wooden shutters on the inside, possibly some oiled linen or thin scraped horn, serving as a translucent barrier, and maybe if you're particularly wealthy, a few small panes of glass set in lead frames. The shutters are thick oak, heavy enough that closing them requires actual effort, and they're designed to keep out wind, rain, snow, and apparently metaphysical threats. A servant approaches the first window. This is typically the same person who's been managing the fire. The firekeeper we'll discuss more later, because window management and fire management are considered related duties. Both involve regulating the chamber's relationship with the outside world. The servant carries a small wooden mallet which seems ominous until you realise it is just for securing the shutters tightly. Before closing the shutters, the servant performs the first strange action, 3 knocks on the window frame. Not random knocks, deliberate, evenly spaced, firm enough to be heard but not violent. The knocks follow a rhythm that household manuals describe as the pattern of the Trinity, which means knock, pause, knock, pause, knock, presumably representing Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, though some regional variations exist. One Bavarian household record specifies 4 knocks for the 4 directions, so clearly there was some theological disagreement about proper window knocking protocol. Why the knocking? The explanation varies depending on which household manual or folk tradition you consult. Some sources claim the knocks frighten away evil spirits that might be lurking outside waiting for the window to close so they can slip through at the last second. Other sources suggest the knocks are an announcement to protective spirits that the chamber is about to be sealed for the night, giving them time to enter if they wish to guard the sleeper. Historians still argue which interpretation was more common, but either way, someone decided that windows needed to be knocked on, and the practice spread widely enough to appear in records across multiple countries. After the knocking, the servant speaks. Not loudly, more of a firm murmur directed at the window itself as if the window can hear. The most common phrase recorded in various forms across French, English, and German households translates roughly to, "By this seal let no harm pass, let no cold enter, let sleep be undisturbed until dawn." Some versions are more elaborate, invoking specific saints. One particularly nervous household in Burgundy had a 12-line prayer for each window that mentioned St. Christopher, St. Michael, the Virgin Mary, and for some reason, St. Eligius, the patron saint of horses, though what horses have to do with window security remains a historical mystery. The servant closes the shutter. Not all the way, not yet. First they inspect the interior surface of the shutter for crack splinters or any irregularities that might allow drafts. If they find any, a bit of cloth or moss is stuffed into the gap. This is practical. Cold drafts genuinely would make sleeping miserable, but it's also tied to the belief that evil could slip through even the smallest openings. Thin as a blade of grass is how one medieval text describes a demon's potential entry width, which is terrifying if you think about it too long. Now the shutter swings fully closed, and here's where the mallet comes in. The servant drives a wooden peg into the catch that holds the shutter secure, tapping it home with precise strikes. The peg is usually carved from rowan wood or ash, both considered protective materials in medieval folk belief. Some households bless these pegs annually, others replace them monthly, and at least one paranoid family kept the pegs in a reliquary, between uses as if treating them like holy objects would increase their protective powers. This process repeats for each window. Knock 3 times, speak the sealing phrase inspect for gaps. Close the shutter, secure with the blessed peg. If your chamber has 4 windows, you're watching this happen 4 times, and each iteration takes about 2 minutes. It's meditative in a way, the repetition, the rhythm of wood on wood, the murmured prayers blending with the sound of shutters settling into their frames. But wait, there's more. In some households, particularly those in regions with strong folk traditions, the servant now traces a symbol on each closed shutter using chalk or charcoal. The most common symbol is a cross, obviously, but other protective marks appear in various record circles, pentacles, stylized hands, or combinations of letters that supposedly spell out angel names. One English household manual from 1489 recommends drawing the letters Verosensem V, which stands for Vade Retro Satana Nunquam Suade Mihi Vana. Basically, step back Satan, never tempt me with vanities. This was apparently painted on shutters, doors, and occasionally foreheads, because medieval Christians were very serious about telling Satan to back off. Historians still argue whether these chalk marks were genuinely believed to have power, or were more like security theatre actions that made people feel safer even if they didn't technically do anything. But here's the thing, multiple household accounts mention servants being punished for forgetting to mark the shutters, which suggests that nobles took this seriously enough to enforce it. Now comes an interesting variation that appears primarily in coastal or northern regions where winter storms were particularly brutal, the night vapours concern. Medieval medical theory held that bad air, miasma, could enter through windows and cause illness, nightmares, or death. This wasn't entirely wrong. Cold drafts in winter genuinely were dangerous, and poor ventilation in summer could exacerbate disease. But the medieval solution wasn't just to close the windows, it was to seal them with cloth soaked in vinegar or wine, which supposedly purified the air and prevented vapours from seeping through. One Scottish castle record from 1461 describes servants applying vinegar-soaked rags to every window seam, creating an airtight seal that must have made the chamber smell like a salad. The same record notes that the noble complained of headaches the next morning, which historians attribute to either the vinegar fumes or the complete lack of fresh air circulation. But apparently neither explanation occurred to anyone at the time. The windows are now sealed. The chamber is darker, not pitch black, because there's still firelight, and probably a candle or two, but definitely dimmer. The outside world is shut out. No sounds of wind, no glimpses of night sky, no awareness of what's happening beyond these walls. You're in a sealed box of stone and wood cut off from the world-breathing air that 17 people have already breathed, surrounded by blessed pegs and chalk marks that may or may not protect you from Satan. The servant steps back from the final window, surveys the room to ensure all shutters are properly secured and nods with satisfaction. You're officially locked in for the night. Sleep tight. You're finally approaching the actual bed, that massive wooden fortress draped with blessed linens and surrounded by strategically positioned dogs. But here's the thing about medieval beds in medieval castles. During medieval winters, they're cold. Bone-achingly, breath-freezingly cold. The sheets feel like they've been stored in a snowbank. The mattress, stuffed with straw or wool or feathers depending on your wealth, radiates the temperature of the stone walls around you. Climbing into this bed right now would be like voluntarily entering a fabric-lined refrigerator. So you don't. Not yet. Because first someone else is going to get in. Enter the bed warmer, which, in this context, isn't a device, it's a person. An actual human being whose job tonight is to lie in your bed until their body heat warms the sheets, then vacate the premises just before you climb in. This practice is documented across multiple European noble households from the 13th through the 16th centuries, and every time historians mention it in academic papers, you can sense their discomfort with how weird it is. The designated bed warmer is usually a young servant, often a page or a maid, chosen for this duty based on criteria that varied by household. Some families preferred younger servants because they supposedly generated more heat. Others chose based on cleanliness. You didn't want someone with muddy feet or questionable hygiene climbing into your sanctified linens. One household manual from Flanders in 1447 specifies that the bed warmer should be free from illness of good character and recently washed, which raises questions about how often servants were unwashed and of questionable character. The bed warmer removes their shoes always and their outer garments, if they're wearing any, leaving them in just a simple undertunic or shift. They climb onto the bed, which requires navigating around dogs that may or may not appreciate this intrusion into their space. The primary hunting hound at the foot of the bed usually ignores this, having seen it every night, but younger dogs sometimes get excited and need to be gently redirected by another servant. Once on the bed warmer lies down in the exact position you'll occupy. If you sleep on the right side, they lie on the right side. If you prefer the middle, they take the middle. The goal is to warm the specific area where your body will be, not the entire bed, because that would be impossible. They pull the covers over themselves, all those layers of wool and linen and possibly fur that were blessed earlier, and they just lie there, waiting, radiating heat into fabric. How long does this take? Most household manuals suggest the length of time to recite the Pater Noster 5 times, or until the fire burns down by one hand's width, which translates to roughly 15 to 20 minutes. Some households had the bed warmer stay longer, up to half an hour. One particularly demanding noble in a German castle apparently required 2 bed warmers working in shifts. One would warm the bed for 15 minutes, then switch out for a fresh, even warmer servant for another 15 minutes, maximising the heat transfer. This seems excessive even by medieval standards, but the household accounts paid both servants, so it definitely happened. Here's where it gets slightly uncomfortable. While the bed warmer is lying in your bed, you're standing nearby, possibly sitting in a chair waiting. You're watching someone occupy your sleeping space, which creates a strange power dynamic that medieval people apparently didn't find as awkward as we do. Some nobles used this time to continue their evening prayers kneeling at their bedside while a servant literally kept their spot warm. Others reviewed household accounts with their chamberlain, discussing tomorrow's schedule, while periodically glancing at the bed to assess warming progress. The bed warmer isn't sleeping. They're not allowed to fall asleep. That would be a serious offence, both because it would delay your bedtime and because sleeping in a noble's bed without permission crosses a line that even medieval social flexibility didn't permit. Household manuals sometimes note that a second servant should stand nearby to ensure the bed warmer remains awake, which means there's now someone watching someone else lie in your bed, which adds another layer of absurdity to this entire situation. Historians still argue about whether this practice was primarily practical or also symbolic. Obviously, a warm bed is more comfortable than a cold one, that's indisputable, but there's also something about having another human pre-warm your sleeping space that speaks to the levels of service and control that defined noble life. Your food was pre-tasted, your clothes were pre-arranged, your hair was pre-braided, and now your bed was pre-warmed. You didn't interact with the world directly. Servants mediated every experience, including temperature. Some sources suggest that in particularly cold climates, northern England, Scotland, Scandinavia, multiple servants might lie in the bed together to generate more heat faster. One Scottish castle record mentions 3 maids for the warming of the lady's bed on especially brutal winter nights, which conjures the image of servants packed into a noble's bed like medieval hot water bottles, which they essentially were. After the designated warming period, a senior servant, usually the chamberlain or a trusted lady-in-waiting, signals that time's up. The bed warmer sits up, carefully extracts themselves from the covers without disturbing the warmth they've created, and climbs out of the bed. They're not supposed to make eye contact with you during this exit, which is another one of those rules that existed to maintain the fiction that what just happened wasn't deeply strange. The bed warmer steps aside, often moving to a corner of the room where they'll remain for the rest of the night in case you need something. Their face might be flushed from lying under heavy blankets. They might be slightly sweaty, which is actually ideal because that moisture has transferred heat to the linens. They've done their job. You approach the bed. You place your hand on the sheet where the bed warmer was lying, testing the temperature. It's warm. Not hot, but noticeably significantly warmer than the rest of the bed or the ambient air in the chamber. The linens hold the ghost of body heat, a transferred warmth that will last maybe 30 minutes before fading back to stone-cold reality. But 30 minutes is enough time to fall asleep, and that's what matters. A servant holds back the bed curtains. Yes, we still haven't discussed the curtains properly that's coming, and you prepare to finally get into your own bed. The dogs watch with interest, probably wondering why human bedtime requires so much theatre when they can just circle 3 times and collapse. The warm spot awaits, still holding the shape and heat of someone else's body ready to receive yours. At least it's not cold anymore. You're standing at the edge of your bed, the sheets are warm, the dogs are settled, and you're so close to actually lying down that you can almost taste the sleep. But wait, what's that on your head right now? Your hair is braided and oiled, yes, but it's uncovered, exposed. And apparently this is a problem that requires immediate correction, because sleeping with an uncovered head was considered somewhere between unhealthy and spiritually dangerous, depending on which medieval authority you asked. Enter the nightcap, which sounds like a simple garment, just a cloth hat you wear to bed. But like everything else in this endless ritual, it comes with ceremony, superstition, and an absurd level of formality that transforms putting on a hat into a production worthy of a theatre troupe. A servant approaches carrying the nightcap on a small cushion. Yes, a cushion. Not in her hands like a normal person would carry a hat, but presented on a cushion as if it's a crown or a sacred relic. This isn't universal. Smaller households probably skip the cushion, but in wealthier families the cushion was standard. The cushion itself might be embroidered with the family crest or religious symbols, because apparently even the thing that holds the hat needs to announce your status. The nightcap is usually made of linen or silk depending on wealth and season. Winter nightcaps are often lined with fur rabbit squirrel, or if you're extraordinarily rich, ermine. Summer nightcaps are lighter, just a single layer of fine linen, but still considered essential. The cap covers your entire head down to your ears, sometimes with ear flaps that tie under your chin if it's particularly cold. Some caps have a tassel at the top which serves no functional purpose, but looks dignified, or at least as dignified as a grown adult wearing a cloth hat with a tassel can look. Before the cap touches your head, it must be inspected. The servant examining it is looking for several things: holes or tears that might let in night vapours, loose threads that could be signs of wear, or possibly witchcraft depending on household paranoia levels and general cleanliness. One household record from northern France in 1472 describes a noble who required his nightcap to be aired by an open fire for the duration of 3 Hail Marys, before wearing supposedly to drive out any lingering dampness or evil that might have accumulated since the previous night. Once the inspection is complete, the real ceremony begins. The servant holds the nightcap in both hands and positions herself directly in front of you. If you're a man, you bow your head slightly, not a full bow, just a dip that allows access to your skull. If you're a woman, you might kneel on a cushion beside the bed, which seems excessive for putting on a hat, but here we are. The servant raises the nightcap above your head, and here's where it gets ritualistic. She doesn't just place it on your head. She lowers it slowly, deliberately, while reciting a prayer or blessing. The most common blessing recorded in various forms across multiple countries goes something like, "May this covering protect the mind from evil thoughts, the head from night terrors, and the soul from wandering in darkness." Some versions are shorter, just "Blessed be this rest," or similar. Some are significantly longer. One Italian household manual includes a 12-line prayer that mentions the Virgin Mary, 3 different saints, and asks for protection against nightmares, demons, and visions sent by Satan to trouble the sleeping. That's a lot of spiritual heavy lifting for a cloth hat. The nightcap settles onto your head, and the servant adjusts it, making sure it covers your ears completely and sits evenly. If your cap has ties or strings, these are secured now under your chin. If you're particularly concerned about the cap coming off during sleep or behind your head, if you're willing to risk it. The adjustment process involves a surprising amount of tugging and repositioning, as if getting the nightcap precisely correct is crucial to your survival until morning. Given medieval beliefs about body heat escaping through the skull and demons entering through the top of the head, maybe they thought it was. Here's a detail that appears in several English household accounts and sounds completely made up, but isn't some families required that the nightcap be placed on the head in a specific number of movements? One record specifies 3 motions to honour the Trinity, meaning the servant had to lower the cap partially, lower it more, then settle it fully into place. Getting it on in 2 movements, or 4 movements, was considered incorrect and would require starting over. Historians still argue whether this was religious devotion or obsessive-compulsive tendency being dressed up as piety. If you're married and your spouse is present in the chamber, they also receive a nightcap through an identical process performed by their own attendant. Both of you are now standing or kneeling near the bed wearing matching nightcaps, probably feeling ridiculous, but unable to acknowledge it because this is serious bedtime business. Some couples had matching caps embroidered with their initials or family crests, which is either romantic or a medieval version of those awkward couples' costumes depending on your perspective. Now comes an aspect that shows up particularly in Northern European households. The nightcap blessing wasn't considered complete until you'd worn it for a few moments while standing. Not just wearing it standing upright, while wearing it supposedly to allow the blessing to settle into the fabric and your head simultaneously. This waiting period was usually filled with more prayers either spoken aloud by the chaplain if he's still present or silently by you, while servants bustled around performing final preparations. One genuinely odd variation appears in a Flemish household record from 1458, a noble who required his nightcap to be touched by a specific religious medallion before being placed on his head. The medallion supposedly contained a fragment of St. Augustine's robe, and touching it to the nightcap each night was believed to grant the wearer holy protection during sleep. Whether the medallion was genuine or just a piece of old cloth that someone claimed was Augustine's robe is impossible to verify, but the household paid regular fees to keep the medallion on the property, so they clearly took it seriously. Your nightcap is on. Your head is covered, blessed and protected from vapours, demons, and whatever else medieval people thought attacked sleeping skulls. You look around your chamber at the servants still present at the dogs, now dozing at the fire burning low, but steady at the bed with its warm spot gradually cooling, and you're wearing a cloth hat with possibly a tassel, and everyone is treating this as completely normal. Because it is normal. This is what nobles do. This is what your parents did, what their parents did, stretching back generations. You've been wearing nightcaps since childhood, and you'll wear them until you die, and when you die you'll probably be buried in one because even in death apparently your head needs covering. The nightcap coronation is complete. You are crowned for sleep, ready to finally mercifully approach horizontal rest. Almost there. Just when you thought you were finally about to climb into bed, there's a knock at your chamber door. Not a tentative knock, a formal measured knock that follows a specific rhythm you've heard every night for years. It's the signal that your children, if you have any, are about to enter for the nightly farewell ritual. And yes, this is mandatory. And yes, even the children you barely know, because you've outsourced their entire upbringing to nurses and tutors, they're all coming to kiss your hand goodnight, and it's going to take at least 15 minutes. The door opens, and in they come your offspring, arranged in strict birth order, from oldest to youngest, because apparently even spontaneous family affection requires hierarchical structure. They're led by their governess or tutor, who walks slightly ahead like a parade marshal, ensuring no one breaks formation or does anything embarrassing that might reflect poorly on the family. Each child is dressed in their own sleeping garments, miniature nightshirts, tiny nightcaps, robes that drag on the floor, because children's clothing was often made oversized so they could grow into it, which is a nice way of saying nobles were cheap about children's wardrobes. They approach in single file. The oldest child, let's say your son, the heir, who's maybe 12 years old and already been groomed for knighthood or lordship or whatever. Career track involves hitting people with swords. He stops at the designated distance from where you're standing, which is about 3 feet. Not too close, that would be presumptuous. Not too far, that would be disrespectful. 3 feet is the precise distance that medieval etiquette determined was appropriate for a child addressing a parent in formal evening circumstances. He bows. Not a casual nod, but a proper bow from the waist hands at his sides, held for a count of 3 before rising. You extend your hand and he steps forward to kiss it. Not your cheek, your hand. Specifically the back of your hand near the knuckles, which is the formal greeting, farewell gesture for showing respect to someone of higher rank. The fact that you're his parent is secondary to the fact that you're his social superior. That's just how noble families worked. Warmth and hierarchy weren't mutually exclusive, they just existed in clearly defined lanes. After kissing your hand, the heir speaks his rehearsed line. The specific wording varies by family, but it's usually something like, "I bid you good night, my Lord Father, and pray for your peaceful rest," or "God grant you restful sleep, my Lady Mother, until the morning." He's been practicing this phrase since he was old enough to form sentences. He probably says it in his sleep by now. If he forgets or mispronounces a word, the governess will pinch his arm later, as a reminder to do better tomorrow. You respond with your own formal acknowledgement. Maybe "God keep you through the night," or "Sleep well, my son," or something equally measured. You're not having a conversation, you're performing a ritual exchange of blessings. There might be genuine affection underneath this formality, or there might not be. Medieval noble families had complicated relationships with their children, who were often raised separately, betrothed to strangers, and viewed primarily as political or economic assets. But either way, the words are said, the forms are observed, and your heir steps aside to make room for the next child. The second child approaches. Maybe it's a daughter, maybe another son. Birth order matters more than gender in this particular lineup. Same bow, same hand kiss, same rehearsed phrase. If she's very young, maybe 5 or 6, she might stumble over the words or giggle nervously, and you might soften slightly, maybe even smile, which is about as emotionally demonstrative as noble parent-child interactions typically got in formal settings. The governess hovers nearby, ready to correct any serious breaches of protocol but allowing minor childhood awkwardness to pass. This continues through however many children you have. Medieval noble families varied wildly in size. Some had 2 or 3 children, others had 8 or 10. If you count the ones who survived infancy, which not all of them did. Each child must approach individually, bow or curtsy, kiss your hand, recite their line and receive your response. No shortcuts, no group blessing. Each child gets their individual moment of formal good night, which probably felt very important and special when they were young and increasingly tedious as they got older. Here's where it gets slightly touching in a way that medieval people probably didn't consciously recognize. This might be the only time all day you've actually acknowledged your children's existence. Noble parents, especially fathers, often had minimal direct interaction with their offspring. The children lived in different parts of the castle, ate separately, studied with tutors, played with other noble children, and existed in a parallel household that only intersected with yours during formal occasions. This nightly ritual was one of the few guaranteed points of contact, brief, formulaic, but at least present. Some household records mention additional elements to the children's procession. In certain families, after kissing the parent's hand, each child would turn and bow to any other nobles or important guests present in the chamber. Yes, sometimes there were guests in your bedroom during your bedtime ritual. We'll get to that later. One French household in 1463 required children to also bow to the family chaplain and to a specific religious painting on the wall, which turned the whole procession into an extended tour of bowing to everything important in the room. If you have very young children, toddlers or infants, they don't participate in the procession. They're already in bed, presumably being watched by their wet nurse or nursemaid in the nursery section of the castle. But there's sometimes a representative gesture. The nurse might send a message via a servant, or she might bring the infant to the doorway of your chamber for you to see briefly, though not to touch, because that would require you to walk over there and interrupt your own bedtime preparations. One household record mentions a noble who insisted on being shown his infant daughter through the doorway every night, so that she might know her father's face, even though she was 3 months old and couldn't possibly retain that information. But the thought counted, apparently. The procession concludes when the youngest participating child has completed their farewell. The governess gathers them back into formation, and they exit in reverse order, youngest to oldest this time, for reasons that probably made sense to someone centuries ago. The door closes behind them. You won't see them again until tomorrow, maybe at breakfast, if you take meals with the family, more likely not until the next evening's procession. Historians still argue about what these rituals meant to the people performing them. Were they genuinely comforting bedtime routines that reinforced family bonds, or were they cold formalities that maintained hierarchical distance, even between parents and children? Probably both simultaneously, which is peak medieval nobility, performing affection through structure, expressing love through protocol, saying good night like it's a diplomatic negotiation. The children are gone now. The chamber feels quieter, though it's still occupied by several servants, some sleepy dogs, and you in your nightcap looking like a fancy ghost. Finally, you can approach the bed. Or can you? Because there are still more rituals. Of course there are. You've survived the children's procession, you're wearing your blessed nightcap, your bed has been warmed by another human being, and you're approximately 3 steps away from actually climbing under the covers. But then you hear it, the gentle plucking of lute strings from somewhere in the corner of your chamber. Because of course, your household employs someone whose job is to play you to sleep, like you're an overtired toddler who needs musical sedation. The musician, usually a lutist, sometimes a harpist, occasionally someone with a vielle or psaltery depending on regional preferences, and what your great-grandfather decided was appropriately soothing, has been sitting quietly in the corner this entire time. They've watched you bathe, get dressed, be blessed, arrange dogs, seal windows, receive children, and don the nightcap. They've been patient, waiting for their cue, which comes now signalled by either the chamberlain's nod or your own movement toward the bed. Their moment has arrived. The repertoire is not flexible. This is perhaps the most important detail to understand about medieval noble sleep music. You don't get variety. You get the same 3 songs in the same order every single night for years, possibly decades. These songs were selected long ago, maybe by you, maybe by your parents, maybe by some long-dead household steward who decided what constituted proper sleeping music, and they have become as fixed and unchangeable as religious liturgy. Why 3 songs specifically, the records aren't entirely clear, but 3 appears repeatedly across multiple households. It's probably tied to the Trinity symbolism that medieval Christians loved assigning to everything. 3 songs to represent Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. 3 songs to calm the 3 parts of your soul that medieval medicine believed required separate attention: the rational soul, the sensitive soul, and the vegetative soul. Or maybe 3 was just the number that took about 15 to 20 minutes, which was how long it typically took a person to fall asleep after lying down, and someone noticed the pattern and codified it. The first song is almost always slow instrumental, and what medieval musicians would call sombre, though not sad, more contemplative. Common choices included variations on popular hymns, courtly love songs with the lyrics removed so you just got the melody, or original compositions that someone wrote specifically for bedtime and that never saw use anywhere else. One English household record from 1483 lists the first song as the Ballad of the Gentle Rain, which might be a beautiful piece or might sound like someone slowly torturing a lute impossible to know without a recording that won't exist for another 500 years. The lutist plays with their eyes downcast, not making eye contact with you or anyone else in the room. This isn't shyness, it's protocol. Looking directly at a noble during intimate moments like bedtime preparation was considered inappropriate unless you were family or very senior servants. So the musician stares at their instrument fingers moving across strings with the muscle memory of someone who's played these same pieces hundreds of times. You're finally climbing into bed now, assisted by servants who hold back the heavy curtains and ensure you don't trip over a dog or get tangled in your own nightclothes. The bed curtains, thick fabric draperies that hang from a wooden frame around the bed, serve multiple purposes. They create a smaller space within your chamber that's easier to warm. They block drafts. They provide visual privacy, and they muffle sound. Once you're settled and the curtains are partially closed, not all the way yet, that comes later, the music becomes slightly muted, like it's being filtered through fabric, which it is. The first song ends. There's a pause of approximately 5 seconds, enough time for the final note to fade, not long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable, and then the second song begins. This one is usually slightly livelier, though lively is relative when we're talking about medieval lullabies. It might have a more complex melody, perhaps a bit of ornamentation in the playing style. One household manual suggests the second song should recall pleasant memories of daylight hours, which is a poetic way of saying it shouldn't be so dreary that you start contemplating mortality before falling asleep. Here's a genuinely strange detail that appears in multiple sources. Some nobles required the musician to play from memory, never from written music. The reasoning was that looking at sheet music reading while playing meant the musician's attention was divided, and they might miss subtle cues about whether you were actually falling asleep or just lying there awake and annoyed. Without sheet music, the musician could occasionally glance up, observe your breathing patterns or movement behind the bed curtains, and adjust their playing accordingly. Historians still argue whether this made any practical difference, or was just another arbitrary rule that medieval nobles invented to make their servants' lives harder. If you're a particularly difficult sleeper, someone who tosses and turns, who struggles to quiet their mind, who lies awake worrying about taxes or wars, or whether that pain in your side is demons or just indigestion, the musician has been trained to recognize this. They might slow the tempo slightly, play more softly, add gentle repetitions to create a hypnotic effect. Some household manuals describe this as adjusting to the sleeper's humours, which is medieval medicine's way of saying, read the room and adapt your performance. The second song ends, the pause, the third song begins. This final piece is supposed to be the most soothing minimal melody, maximum repetition, slow enough that it feels like time itself is slowing down. One Italian household record describes the third song as the song of stones sinking in still water, which is either beautiful imagery or proof that medieval people were pretentious about everything, including lullabies. By now, if everything has gone according to plan, you're drifting towards sleep. Your breathing has deepened. Your body has relaxed into the warmed sheets. The weight of multiple blankets presses down like a gentle fabric-based sedation. The dogs are fully asleep. You can hear the primary hound snoring softly at the foot of your bed. The fire has burned down to glowing embers. The servants remaining in the chamber have gone quiet, standing or sitting in their designated positions waiting. The third song doesn't end abruptly. Instead, it fades, the musician gradually playing softer and softer until the notes are barely audible, until you're not sure if you're still hearing music or if it's just become part of the ambient sound of the chamber. This fade-out can take several minutes. It's intentional. An abrupt ending might startle you awake, undoing all the careful musical sedation that's been applied over the past 20 minutes. Finally, silence. The musician carefully sets down their instrument, moving slowly to avoid any sudden sounds. They don't leave the chamber. They'll remain there all night, sleeping in a corner or a side room available, in case you wake in the middle of the night and request more music. Yes, this happened. Household records mention nobles waking at 2 or 3 in the morning and demanding the musician play them back to sleep. The musician's job wasn't 9 to 5. It was whenever the noble needed musical services, which could be any time between sunset and sunrise. Here's one final detail that appears in several sources and borders on comic. If you change the playlist, if you decided you wanted different songs or a different order, it required a formal household meeting. The chamberlain, the musician, possibly the household steward, and you would discuss the proposed changes, debate their merits, and reach consensus. One household record describes a debate over replacing the Gentle Rain ballad with a newer composition that lasted 3 separate meetings and concluded with no changes being made because tradition won. Medieval nobles would rather listen to the same songs for their entire lives than go through the bureaucratic hassle of updating the bedtime playlist. The music is over. The chamber breathes quietly, servants' dogs dying fire and you hopefully approaching sleep. But we're not done yet. There's still the matter of the firekeeper. You're in bed now, finally horizontal music fading into silence, and you're on the edge of sleep. But while you drift off into unconsciousness, someone else in your chamber is preparing for the longest, most tedious night of their life. That someone is the firekeeper, a servant whose entire job tonight consists of staying awake, feeding logs into your fireplace at precise intervals, and maintaining a temperature that exists in a narrow band between too cold means you'll die, and too hot means demons will enter the room. No pressure. The firekeeper is usually a younger male servant chosen for this duty because it requires physical stamina. You're going to be awake for 8 to 10 hours straight, crouching and standing, repeatedly moving logs that weigh anywhere from 5 to 20 pounds, and doing it all in near silence so you don't wake the sleeping noble. It's also considered a position of trust because you're going to be alone and conscious in the Lord's bedchamber all night, which means you could theoretically murder everyone while they sleep, so you'd better be someone the household has vetted thoroughly. The firekeeper's station is a small stool positioned roughly 6 to 8 feet from the fireplace, close enough to reach the fire quickly, far enough that you're not being slowly roasted yourself. Next to the stool is a basket containing logs of specific sizes sorted and prepared earlier in the day by someone whose job was just cutting wood to exact dimensions. Yes, the logs are measured. A proper sleeping chamber log should be approximately 1 foot in length and 4 to 6 inches in diameter, according to multiple household manuals. Too large, and it burns too hot too small, and it burns too fast, and either way, you've failed at your job. Here's where it gets mathematically absurd. The fire must be maintained at what medieval households called the proper heat of rest, which was determined not by thermometers, those won't be invented for a while, but by observation and tradition. The fireplace should produce enough heat that a person standing in the centre of the chamber halfway between the fire and the bed can feel warmth, but not discomfort. Too specific, it gets worse. Some household manuals specify that the ideal sleeping chamber fire should cast light that reaches 4 paces from the hearth, but no further because excessive light was believed to prevent deep sleep. The firekeeper measures all of this by watching the fire's behaviour and the room's response. If the flames are reaching higher than 1 foot above the log pile, the fire is too active and needs to be dampened, usually by adjusting the logs or partially closing a vent. If the flames sink below 6 inches, the fire is dying and needs a new log. These measurements were eyeballed, which means the firekeeper developed an almost supernatural ability to judge flame height in the dark. Adding a log isn't a simple process of tossing wood into flames. Oh no! The firekeeper must first assess the current fire structure, how the existing logs are positioned, where the hottest coals are concentrated, which direction the flames are leaning. Then they select an appropriately sized log from the basket, approach the fireplace with it held in both hands using a cloth to protect against splinters, and carefully position it onto the fire in a way that maximizes burn time while maintaining consistent heat output. The log placement follows patterns that were taught through apprenticeship and probably never written down because they were considered obvious to anyone trained in fire management. A common method was the pyramid form, placing new logs on top of existing ones, in a triangular arrangement that allowed air circulation while preventing the fire from collapsing into chaos. Another method popular in northern regions was the lean and support, propping new logs against the back of the fireplace, at an angle so they'd catch fire gradually, rather than all at once. After placing the log, the firekeeper retreats to their stool and waits, watching the fire's response. If the new log catches properly, the flame should rise slightly, not dramatically, and settle into a steady burn. If the log doesn't catch, which happens if it's too damp or was placed incorrectly, the firekeeper has to intervene again, this time using an iron poker to adjust the arrangement. The poker is kept next to the stool specifically for this purpose, and using it requires skill, because moving burning logs in the dark without showering sparks everywhere is harder than it sounds. How often does the fire need attention? It varies based on wood-type log size and how dry the wood is, but generally every 20 to 40 minutes. This means the firekeeper gets no sustained rest. They might doze for 15 minutes between log additions, but they can't enter deep sleep because they're mentally tracking time, listening to the fire's sound, the crackling and popping that indicates active burning versus the quiet settling that means it's dying down. Here's where medieval superstition intersects with practical fire management. The firekeeper is also watching for signs of supernatural interference. Medieval people genuinely believed that demons were attracted to fire, not repelled by it, as we might assume, but drawn to it because fire was associated with hell. A fire that suddenly flares without cause, or that produces unusual colours in the flames, or that makes sounds other than normal crackling could indicate demonic presence. The firekeeper is supposed to recognise these signs and either wake the chamberlain or in some households recite specific prayers over the fire to drive away evil. One household record from Bavaria in 1449 describes a firekeeper who reported seeing green flames in the middle of the night and immediately woke the entire household, claiming demonic attack. Modern historians attribute the green flames to copper residue in the wood. Someone probably burned, painted or decorated wood in an earlier fire, but at the time it was taken seriously enough that a priest was summoned to bless the fireplace before anyone would sleep in that chamber again. The firekeeper also manages the smoke. Even with a proper chimney, medieval fireplaces produce smoke that didn't always draft correctly, especially on windy nights. If smoke starts backing up into the chamber, the firekeeper must act quickly, adjusting the fire's structure, opening a window slightly to change air pressure, or in extreme cases temporarily damping the fire down to minimize smoke output. Waking the noble because the room is filling with smoke is considered a serious failure, the kind that might get you reassigned to worse duties like mucking stables or emptying chamber pots. Throughout the night, the firekeeper maintains a mental log of everything that happens. How many logs were used at what intervals, any unusual behaviour from the fire, any sounds or movements in the chamber. In some households, this information was reported verbally the next morning to the chamberlain. In others, particularly paranoid families, the firekeeper was expected to make physical marks on a tally stick throughout the night, recording each log addition, creating a literal receipt of their vigilance that could be reviewed for accuracy. Historians still argue whether firekeepers actually stayed awake all night every night, or if they frequently dozed off and just got good at waking up quickly when the fire needed attention. Household records mention punishments for firekeepers who fell asleep. Fines, beatings, dismissal in severe cases, which suggest it was a known problem. But they also mention rewards for exemplary firekeepers, including extra food rations and occasional bonuses, which suggests some servants took the job seriously and performed it well. The fire burns on. The firekeeper watches. You sleep unaware that your comfort and possibly your life depends on someone staying awake all night to feed wood into flames at mathematically precise intervals, while simultaneously monitoring for demons. Medieval employment was something else. You're in bed comfortable in your pre-warmed spot, drifting pleasantly toward unconsciousness, with the fire crackling at optimal demon-free levels. But before you can fully surrender to sleep, there's one more ritual that absolutely must be performed, and this one involves touching a piece of a dead person, specifically a dead saint, because medieval Christianity believed that physical contact with holy relics could protect you during sleep, when your soul was considered particularly vulnerable to attack. So mounted somewhere near your bed, usually on the wall directly above the headboard, or on a small shelf within arm's reach, is a reliquary containing what your family claims is an authentic fragment of a saint's body. Let me be clear about what we're discussing here. You're about to press your forehead or hand against a container that supposedly holds a piece of someone's bone, a fragment of their clothing, a strand of their hair, or in particularly ambitious cases, an entire finger or tooth. The reliquary itself is ornate, usually gold or silver, encrusted with whatever gemstones your family could afford, with a small window of crystal or glass through which you can see the relic itself. These containers are beautiful objects commissioned by craftsmen who specialised in making fancy boxes for dead people's body parts, which was apparently a viable medieval career path. A servant, often the chamberlain or a senior attendant, approaches your bedside holding a candle because this ritual requires light. You can't touch a relic in darkness. That would be disrespectful, possibly dangerous, maybe heretical, depending on which theologian you asked. The relic must be visible and acknowledged, not just fumbled at blindly like you're searching for your phone on a nightstand. You sit up slightly in bed, propped on one elbow, or assisted by pillows that servants arrange behind your back. The effort of sitting up after you've just gotten comfortable is annoying, but complaining about having to touch a saint's bone would be the kind of impious statement that gets you talked about behind your back by servants and possibly reported to your household chaplain for spiritual counselling. The servant holds the candle close to the reliquary so you can see it clearly. The candlelight catches the gold, makes the gemstones sparkle, illuminates the relic inside. Maybe it's a brown fragment of what might be bone or a scrap of ancient fabric or something that honestly could be anything, but has been authenticated by church authorities who had their own complicated reasons for declaring things authentic, many of those reasons involving money. What saint does your family's relic belong to? It varies wildly by household. Popular choices included local saints, figures who were venerated in your specific region, and whose relics were theoretically easier to acquire. St. Martin of Tours was popular in France, St. Edward the Confessor in England, St. Boniface in Germany. But some families got creative and claimed relics from major figures, fragments of St. Peter's robe, pieces of St. Catherine's veil, splinters from St. Sebastian's arrows. One household record from Burgundy in 1461 proudly lists ownership of a fingernail of St. Agnes, which raises questions about how one authenticates a fingernail from someone who died over 1,000 years ago. But apparently those questions weren't asked often enough to matter. You reach out and touch the reliquary. Not the relic itself that's sealed inside glass for preservation, and also probably because handling actual ancient human remains every single night would eventually damage them. You touch the container, pressing your hand or forehead against the cool metal or glass surface. Some households had specific protocols about which body part should make contact. Pressing your forehead was considered most spiritually effective because it brought the relic closest to your mind and soul. Pressing your hand was more common, more practical, less likely to smudge the glass with face oils. While touching the reliquary, you're supposed to pray. Sometimes this is a standard prayer in Our Father, a Hail Mary, something memorized and recited so often it's become automatic. Other times it's a personalized appeal to the specific saint whose relic you're touching. Saint Martin, protect me through this night and guide me safely to morning. Saint Catherine, guard my dreams and keep evil from my chamber. Saint Agnes, please let me sleep through the night without having to use the chamber pot again because that whole ritual is exhausting. The prayer shouldn't be rushed. Household manuals specify that the relic touching should last long enough to feel the saint's presence, which is subjective and probably varied from person to person. Some nobles touched the relic for a few seconds, said a quick prayer and called it done. Others lingered, pressing their foreheads against the glass, murmuring extended prayers or personal requests, treating this as a genuine spiritual moment, rather than just another item on the bedtime checklist. Here's where it gets interesting in terms of what medieval people actually believed the relic wasn't just a symbolic focus for prayer. Many nobles genuinely thought the physical proximity to holy remains created a protective barrier around their bed, similar to how blessed linens and chalk marks on shutters supposedly created barriers elsewhere in the chamber. The saint's spiritual power was believed to radiate from their physical remains, creating a zone of holiness that demons couldn't penetrate. Your bed with a relic mounted above it became a kind of spiritually fortified bunker. But here's the uncomfortable truth that historians have to acknowledge: many of these relics were fake. Not all of them, some were likely authentic, or at least authentically old, even if their attributed saint was wrong. But the medieval relic trade was rampant with fraud. Enterprising merchants sold bone fragments from animals claiming they were saints. Pieces of ordinary cloth were aged and distressed to look ancient, then sold with elaborate provenance stories. One scholarly estimate suggests that, if all the claimed fragments of the true cross were authentic, the original cross would have been large enough to crucify a giant. Did nobles know this? Some probably suspected. But questioning your family relic's authenticity was problematic. These relics were often expensive acquisitions purchased by your ancestors, sometimes passed down through generations. Admitting that great-grandfather paid a fortune for a sheep bone that someone claimed was St. Peter's thumb would be embarrassing on multiple levels. Better to believe, or at least to perform belief, and to press your forehead against the glass each night because that's what your family has always done. After the touching and prayer are complete, you withdraw your hand or lift your forehead. The servant steps back, taking the candle's light with them. The reliquary returns to being a shadowy presence above your bed still. They're still theoretically protecting you, but no longer the focus of active attention. You settle back into your sleeping position. The pillows are rearranged, the blankets are pulled up. The servant retreats into the shadows of the chamber. You're protected now by blessed linens, sealed windows, chalk marks, strategic dog placement, a vigilant firekeeper, and the spiritual radiation of a dead saint's probable bone fragment. If you don't survive the night with this much supernatural security, you probably deserved it. You're lying down, you've touched your saint bone, and you're seconds away from actual sleep. But wait, before you close your eyes, you need to have a conversation with someone about dreams you haven't even had yet. Because in medieval noble households, dreams weren't just random brain static that happened during sleep. They were messages, prophecies, warnings from God, temptations from demons, or symptoms of humoral imbalance that required medical attention. And all of that meant you needed a dream interpreter on staff. And that interpreter needed to be briefed before you fell asleep about what they should be looking for when you wake up and describe your night visions. The dream interpreter, sometimes called the dream reader, or in fancier Latin-loving households, the somniator, approaches your bedside. This person occupies a strange position in the household hierarchy. They're not quite a physician, though they often have medical training. They're not quite a priest, though they frequently have theological education. They're sort of a combination of psychologist, fortune teller, and medical consultant. And their job security depends on their ability to tell you what your dreams mean in ways that are simultaneously believable, flattering, and not too alarming. The interpreter kneels beside your bed or stands at a respectful distance, depending on household formality, and asks the critical question, "What guidance do you require for tonight's visions, my lord?" Or, "What concerns should I attend to in tomorrow's interpretation, my lady?" This isn't a casual inquiry. What you say right now will shape how they interpret whatever dream you report in the morning. Medieval dream interpretation was heavily influenced by the dreamer's pre-sleep mental state, current worries, and basically whatever you tell the interpreter to pay attention to. Let's say you're worried about a political negotiation happening next week. You mention this to the interpreter. "I've been thinking about the meeting with the Duke. I'm concerned about his intentions." The interpreter nods seriously, possibly makes a note on a wax tablet if they're literate. It mentally files this information. Tomorrow morning, when you describe your dream, let's say you dreamt about a fox stealing chickens, the interpreter will connect that imagery to your stated concern. The fox represents the Duke, obviously. The chickens are your family's interests. The stealing indicates treachery. You should be cautious in the negotiation. See how that works. Or maybe you tell the interpreter that you've been feeling unwell, experiencing headaches or stomach discomfort. Now, the interpreter knows to look for dreams involving water, blood, dark animals, or falling, because medieval medical theory connected these images to physical illness. If you dream about drowning, that indicates an excess of phlegm. Dreams about fire suggest too much yellow bile. Dreams about darkness mean black bile is dominating your system. The interpreter will recommend specific remedies based on these dream diagnoses: bloodletting, herbal concoctions, dietary changes, prayer. Here's where it gets manipulative, and historians have documented this in household correspondence and personal letters. Some nobles used dream interpreters as a socially acceptable way to make decisions they'd already made, but wanted to attribute to divine guidance. You've decided to dismiss a disloyal servant, but firing someone without cause looks petty. So you tell your dream interpreter that you're concerned about betrayal in your household. That night you happen to dream about a servant stealing silver candlesticks. The interpreter confirms that this dream is a prophetic warning. You're now justified in firing the servant because God sent you a warning dream, not because you just don't like them. The dream interpreter also receives instructions about what not to interpret. Certain types of dreams were considered too private, too embarrassing, or too politically sensitive to discuss. Sexual dreams, for instance, were common but rarely officially interpreted unless they involved public figures or religious symbolism. Dreams about the king or queen were extremely delicate. Interpreting them wrongly could be treason. One household manual from 1470s England specifically warns dream interpreters to speak with caution when visions concern those of royal blood, for prophecy and sedition differ only in outcome. Some nobles had recurring dreams that required special handling. One French household record mentions a nobleman who regularly dreamed about being chased by wolves night after night for years. His dream interpreter developed a standard response. The wolves represented worldly temptations, the running represented his spiritual vigilance, and the fact that he never got caught meant God was protecting him. This interpretation satisfied the noble and probably became so routine that the interpreter could deliver it half asleep. After you've provided your guidance, or if you have no specific concerns after you've indicated that the interpreter should proceed with standard analysis, they offer a brief bedtime blessing focused on dreams. May your visions be clear, and your rest be guided by divine wisdom, or something similar. Some interpreters included requests for specific types of dreams. May you dream of gardens and flowing water, which medieval dream theory associated with prosperity and good health. The interpreter doesn't leave the chamber. Like several other servants, they'll remain present all night, usually sleeping lightly in a corner or adjacent room, because there's a possibility you'll wake from a particularly vivid or disturbing dream and want immediate interpretation. This apparently happened often enough that having the interpreter nearby was considered essential. Imagine waking at 3 a.m. from a nightmare about falling into a pit of snakes and being able to immediately summon someone to explain what it means. That's either very reassuring or incredibly enabling, depending on your perspective. One detail that appears in multiple household records: dream interpreters kept journals. They recorded the dreams. Nobles reported their interpretations and the outcomes that followed. This served multiple purposes. It helped them track patterns. If you regularly dreamed about water before getting sick, they could start warning you about health issues when water appeared in dreams. It also protected them professionally if a noble claimed the interpreter got something wrong. They could reference their journals showing what was actually said. And it provided training material for apprentice interpreters, because apparently this was a skill that required formal education. Historians still argue about whether medieval nobles genuinely believed in dream interpretation or just maintained the practice because it was traditional. The evidence suggests both. Personal letters often reference dreams and their interpretations in ways that seem genuinely concerned and believing. But there are also examples of nobles clearly manipulating the system using dream interpretation as political or social tools. As with many medieval practices, belief and pragmatism existed simultaneously, and people probably didn't worry too much about the contradiction. The interpreter finishes their briefing and retreats. You're free to close your eyes now, knowing that whatever bizarre imagery your sleeping brain produces will be analysed tomorrow morning by someone whose job is to make it all mean something significant. Sleep dream, and hope you don't dream about anything that could be interpreted as treason. Now we arrive at what is arguably the most uncomfortable, invasive and genuinely shocking aspect of medieval noble bedtime rituals. And I want to be clear up front, this didn't happen every night. It wasn't universal across all households, and historians still debate how common it actually was. But it happened often enough to appear in multiple household records, legal documents, and personal correspondence, which means we have to talk about it. Sometimes if you were a married noble, particularly a newly married noble, or a noble whose marriage was politically important, or a noble whose heir's legitimacy needed to be unquestionable, a servant remained in your bedchamber during intimate moments to serve as a legal witness. Yes, a witness. To sex. In your bedroom, standing in the corner, watching, or at least being present and theoretically able to confirm that consummation occurred, which was legally necessary for certain marriages to be considered valid. Let me explain the historical context before this gets any more awkward. Medieval marriage wasn't primarily about love or personal choice. It was a legal contract often involving significant property transfers, political alliances and inheritance rights. For these marriages to be binding, they had to be consummated. Just saying vows wasn't enough. Physical union had to occur, and in cases where the marriage's validity might be challenged later, say in inheritance disputes or annulment proceedings, there needed to be witnesses who could testify under oath that consummation happened. The practice was most common with royal and high noble families where succession was critical. When a prince married a princess to secure a treaty between kingdoms, both families had enormous investments in ensuring the marriage was legally unassailable. This meant witnesses. The most famous example is probably the bedding ceremony that occurred after royal weddings, where the bride and groom were escorted to their chamber by crowds of nobles, who sometimes literally watched them get into bed together before leaving. But in some cases, a designated witness remained. Who was this witness? Usually a high-ranking member of the household, a chamberlain, a senior lady-in-waiting, sometimes even a bishop or other church official. Not a random servant. This had to be someone whose testimony would be credible in legal proceedings, someone whose word carried weight. And they had to be someone both families trusted, which often meant someone who had served the family for decades and whose loyalty was unquestionable. What exactly did they witness? This is where the historical record gets deliberately vague because medieval people were uncomfortable writing explicitly about this too. Most accounts use euphemistic language. The witness confirmed that the marriage was completed, that the union was achieved, that the couple fulfilled their marital obligations. Legal documents reference witnesses who could testify to seeing the couple retire together and remain together for sufficient time, which is a very careful way of not describing what they actually saw while still establishing that something presumably happened. Historians still argue about whether witnesses actually observed the intimate act itself or simply confirmed that the couple was alone together in bed for long enough that consummation could plausibly have occurred. Some sources suggest the witness stood behind bed curtains or in an adjacent room with the door ajar present but not directly viewing. Other sources, particularly those describing royal consummations, imply more direct observation. One account from a 15th century French royal wedding describes witnesses who remained until the completion was assured beyond doubt, which sounds horrifyingly thorough. The couple's feelings about this are rarely recorded because medieval documents didn't prioritize emotional experiences, but we can imagine it was awful. You're expected to perform intimately while knowing someone is standing 10 feet away, listening if not watching, whose job is to later swear under oath that you successfully had sex. This psychological pressure must have been immense, particularly for young couples in arranged marriages who barely knew each other and were already nervous about their wedding night without adding an audience. Some couples apparently coped by treating the witness as furniture, ignoring their presence, pretending they weren't there, proceeding as if they were alone. Others reportedly struggled with the pressure of observation, leading to performance difficulties, which then raised questions about whether the marriage was valid, which created more pressure, which made things worse. At least one annulment case from 15th century Italy references a husband who could not complete the union due to excessive scrutiny, though whether he was making excuses or genuinely affected by the witness's presence is impossible to determine. In longer marriages, the witness situation changed. Once you'd produced an heir or two, once the marriage's validity was established beyond challenge, the witnesses stopped attending. Your bedroom became actually private, or at least as private as a room constantly occupied by servants could be. But for some couples, particularly those in politically sensitive positions, witnesses might be requested again if there were questions about paternity. If you were a queen and pregnancy was announced, there might be witnesses to confirm that you and the king had actually been together around the appropriate time, protecting against later claims that the child wasn't legitimate. Here's a detail that appears in several sources and shows just how institutionalized this practice was. Some households had official witness protocols, written procedures describing how the witness should conduct themselves, where they should stand, what they should observe, how long they should remain, what they should document. One household manual from Burgundy specifies that the witness should remain until the couple indicates completion, or until sufficient time has passed that completion must be assumed, being no less than the time required to recite 5 pater nosters. That's roughly 5 minutes for anyone wondering about medieval estimates of duration. The witness, after confirming consummation, would typically report to the relevant authority, the head of household, the family patriarch, sometimes even the bishop if the marriage was particularly important. This report was often recorded in writing, becoming part of the official family archives. Some of these documents survive in historical collections, and they make for deeply uncomfortable reading. On this date, I witnessed the marriage of names being completed according to law and custom. Shows up repeatedly in various forms. Why am I including this section when it's clearly not a nightly ritual for most nobles? Because it illustrates something crucial about medieval noble life privacy. As we understand, it didn't exist. Even your most intimate moments could be subject to observation if family interests required it. The bedchamber wasn't a sanctuary from the world, it was another room where household business occurred, where servants were constantly present, where the line between public and private was blurred to the point of meaninglessness. For most married nobles, on most nights, there was no witness to marital intimacy. Your servants would withdraw, giving you actual privacy, and you could be alone with your spouse in ways that felt relatively normal by any era's standards. But the fact that witnesses were even possible, that they happened often enough to be documented and proceduralized, tells us something about how differently medieval nobility experienced their lives compared to ours. The witness, when present, would eventually leave. The couple would be alone finally to sleep, or not sleep, to talk, or remain silent to navigate their relationship without an audience. Unless, of course, the firekeeper was still awake in the corner feeding logs into the fireplace every 20 minutes. Privacy remained relative. You've made it through everything: the bathing, the blessing, the dog arrangement, the relic touching, the possibly witnessed intimacy, and you're lying in bed exhausted by the sheer bureaucracy of trying to sleep. But before you can fully relax, there's one final layer of protection that needs to be established, and this one involves geometry iron and a deeply paranoid belief that witches might fly through your window at night specifically to curse you. Welcome to anti-witch preparations, where medieval nobles turn their bedchambers into supernatural obstacle courses designed to confuse, repel, or trap malevolent magic. The belief in night-flying witches was widespread across medieval Europe, though the specifics varied by region and intensified during certain periods, particularly the 14th and 15th centuries. These weren't the fairy tale witches on broomsticks, though the image has medieval roots, but rather people, usually women, who were believed to practice malevolent magic and could spiritually or physically travel at night to harm their enemies. Nobles, being wealthy and powerful, assumed they were prime targets. Whether you personally believed in witches or not, if your household believed in them, you were going through the anti-witch ritual, whether you liked it or not. A servant, often the same one who sealed the windows earlier, now moves through the chamber, placing iron objects at specific locations. Iron was considered the most effective material against witchcraft across virtually all European folk traditions. The reasoning varied. Some believed iron was blessed by God. Others thought it was simply anathema to magical forces. Still others claimed it disrupted the spiritual energy that witches used for their curses. Whatever the explanation, iron protection was taken seriously. The most common iron objects were knives, scissors, horseshoes, and nails. These weren't just dropped randomly around the room, they were positioned according to geometric patterns that were supposed to create barriers or traps. A typical arrangement might include a knife placed under your mattress blade pointing toward the headboard, scissors opened in an X shape on the windowsill, horseshoes mounted above the door and sometimes above the bed, and iron nails driven into the bedposts or hammered into the floor at the corners of the bed, creating a square or diamond pattern. Why geometry? Medieval people inherited classical ideas about sacred shapes having power. Circles represented perfection and divine protection. Triangles invoked the Trinity. Squares represented the 4 elements and the 4 directions. If you arranged protective objects in these shapes, you supposedly created zones that evil couldn't penetrate. One household manual from 1450s Bavaria includes a diagram showing proper iron nail placement around a bed, and it looks like someone trying to summon a demon rather than repel one, but apparently it worked the opposite way. Here's where it gets specific enough that historians suspect people were making things up as they went. Some households required that the iron objects be arranged at exact angles. One English source specifies that scissors must be placed at the angle of the sun's setting, which presumably meant oriented toward where sunset occurred, though how you'd maintain this year-round as sunset direction changed is unclear. Another source demands that knives be positioned sharp edge toward the north to cut the path of northern winds that carry curses. These instructions sound authoritative, but are probably just folk tradition that someone decided to write down as if it was science. Salt also played a role in anti-witch preparations, though it's less frequently mentioned in household records, possibly because salt was expensive and using it for supernatural protection every single night was wasteful. Some families sprinkled salt along windowsills or in lines across doorways, creating barriers that witches supposedly couldn't cross. The salt had to be blessed by a priest to be effective. Regular salt was just seasoning, which meant your household needed a supply of holy salt that was restocked whenever it ran out, adding another item to the weekly shopping list right next to turnips and candles. Certain herbs were also hung in the chamber, or stuffed into small pouches placed around the bed. Rosemary, rue vin, and mugwort were popular anti-witch herbs, each with specific supposed properties. Rosemary improved memory and prevented magical confusion. Rue repelled evil spirits. Vervain protected against enchantments. Mugwort, oddly specifically, was believed to protect against being turned into an animal during sleep, which was apparently a common enough worry that multiple sources mention it. The idea that you might go to bed human and wake up as a toad because a witch cursed you during the night sounds absurd, but medieval people took it seriously enough to hang dried plants everywhere. One particularly elaborate protection method involved red thread. Some households tied red thread around bedposts, wove it through the bed curtains, or even sewed it into the hems of sleeping garments. Red was considered magically protective in many folk traditions, possibly because of associations with blood and life force, possibly because red dye was expensive and therefore special. The thread had to be wool, not linen or silk, and ideally it should have been spun by a virgin on a holy day, which is such a specific requirement that you have to wonder how anyone verified it. Yes, this thread was definitely spun by a virgin. We checked her references. The most paranoid households, and there were several documented cases of this, employed what amounts to a night watch specifically for witchcraft. A servant sometimes, the same firekeeper we discussed earlier, was instructed to watch not just the fire but also for signs of magical intrusion. Sudden cold drafts when windows were sealed, unexplained sounds, shadows that moved wrong, animals behaving strangely. Remember those dogs sleeping around your bed? If they suddenly woke up and growled at nothing that was potentially a witch approaching. The night watch servant was supposed to immediately wake the household and possibly summon the chaplain if they detected supernatural activity. Did this ever actually happen? Household records mention it. One German castle account from 1467 describes a night when the watch servant reported manifestations of evil that turned out to be wind causing a loose shutter to bang. The entire household was woken, prayers were said, additional iron was placed, and presumably everyone went back to bed embarrassed but feeling safer. Whether the servant genuinely believed they detected a witch or just panicked at normal sound is impossible to know. Historians still argue about how much of this was genuine belief versus performance. Did nobles actually think witches were flying around trying to curse them? Some clearly did. Personal letters reference fears of witchcraft. Accusations were made, trials occurred. But others probably participated in anti-witch rituals the same way modern people might avoid walking under ladders, not because they genuinely believe it causes bad luck, but because why risk it? And also because everyone around them does it and not participating would be weird. The anti-witch preparations are complete. Your chamber is now surrounded by iron arranged in mystical patterns, protected by salt barriers, defended by herbs, and monitored by a servant who's watching for supernatural threats while simultaneously managing your fire. You're as safe from witchcraft as medieval technology and paranoia can make you. Whether any of this actually protected against anything is questionable. Whether it helped nobles sleep better by making them feel protected is almost certain. And really, in a world without electric lights, modern medicine, or understanding of how diseases spread, a world where random deaths were common and explanations were scarce, maybe magical protection rituals served a genuine psychological purpose. The iron glints in the firelight, the scissors form their X on the windowsill, the red thread loops through the bed curtains. You close your eyes, finally surrounded by enough supernatural security to make a wizard jealous. Sleep comes eventually, or at least unconsciousness does. Tomorrow night you'll do this all again. You're in bed, protected by saints' iron dogs and enough ritual to qualify as a small religious service. Your eyes are closed, your breathing is slowing. Sleep is so close you can almost touch it. But wait, there's one final task that must be completed before anyone in this chamber can fully relax and it's perhaps the most bureaucratic, paranoid, and oddly sensible ritual of the entire night. The Chamberlain is about to count every single person in this room, record that number in a ledger, and then lock you all inside together until morning. The Chamberlain steps forward, holding a candle in one hand and a wax tablet or small ledger book in the other. This is the same person who's been orchestrating your entire bedtime ritual, and they're now approaching the culmination of their nightly duties. Their job is to account for every human being present in your sleeping chamber, verify that no unauthorized persons have entered, confirm that all necessary servants are in position, and then seal the room from the inside. They begin the count systematically moving through the chamber in a predetermined pattern, usually starting from the door and working clockwise or counterclockwise around the perimeter. Each person present is acknowledged with either a nod, a brief touch on the shoulder, or their name being quietly spoken. The count proceeds, "My lord." That's you, the noble, lying in bed, and probably annoyed that this is still happening. "My lady," if you're married, and your spouse is present. "Firekeeper," the servant still awake and tending the hearth. "Bed attendant," the servant who warmed your bed and now waits in case you need assistance during the night. "Chamber guard." In some households, a trusted guard remains inside the room overnight, positioned near the door. Dream interpreter, still present in case you wake from nightmares. Physician, in households where the noble is elderly or ill. A medical attendant might sleep in the chamber. The dog's not counted, which is probably wise, because counting sleeping dogs while they are arranged around a bed seems like a good way to get bitten. But some household records mention the Chamberlain noting hounds present in their ledger, without specifying the exact number, which suggests someone cared about dog attendants even if they weren't doing a precise census. Why this head count? The reasons are layered and reveal medieval nobles' deep anxieties about security. First, accounting for everyone present prevents unauthorized persons from hiding in the chamber. If the count tomorrow morning doesn't match tonight's count, someone either snuck in during the night or someone left, and either scenario is a security problem that needs investigation. This wasn't theoretical paranoia. There are documented cases of assassination attempts that involved infiltrators hiding in bedchambers, waiting for everyone to fall asleep before attacking. Second, the head count establishes legal accountability. If something happens during the night, if the noble dies, if property is stolen, if there's any incident, the recorded list of people present becomes a record of who could possibly be responsible. Every person on that list can be questioned, and if the list is accurate, it narrows the investigation considerably. Medieval justice wasn't sophisticated, but it understood the value of knowing who was where. Third, and more practically, the head count ensures that all necessary servants are actually present and haven't wandered off to sleep somewhere more comfortable. The firekeeper needs to stay awake all night. The bed attendant needs to be available if you wake up needing assistance. If someone's missing from the count, the Chamberlain can send for them before the room is locked, avoiding the problem of discovering at 3 a.m. that the servant you need isn't actually there. After completing the visual and verbal count, the Chamberlain records the total number in their ledger or on their wax tablet. The entries were usually brief. The 12th night of October, year of our Lord 1463. Chamber of Lord Name. Persons present. Lord Name Lady. Name Firekeeper. Thomas Bed Attendant Margaret Chamber Guard Robert. Total 5 souls. Chamber sealed at the hour of Compline. That phrase souls appears frequently in these records, and it's deliberate. These aren't just bodies being counted, they're souls under the noble's protection and authority for the night. The Chamberlain is accounting for everyone's spiritual and physical safety, at least in theory. In practice, they're creating a paper trail that protects themselves as much as anyone else, because if something goes wrong, and there's no accurate count, the Chamberlain is likely to be blamed. Now comes the locking. The Chamberlain moves to the chamber door, which has remained open or slightly ajar throughout the entire bedtime ritual, to allow servants to come and go. They close it now firmly and engage whatever locking mechanism the door has. In wealthier households, this might be an elaborate iron lock with a key. In others, it's a heavy wooden bar that drops into brackets on either side of the door frame. The key point, and this is crucial, is that the door is locked from the inside. The chamberlain keeps the key or controls the bar mechanism. This means no one can enter the chamber from outside without making significant noise that would wake everyone. But it also means no one inside can leave without the chamberlain's cooperation. You're all locked in together until morning or until the chamberlain decides to open the door, which they typically won't do unless there's an emergency or you explicitly command it. This creates an interesting power dynamic. The chamberlain, a servant, temporarily controls access to the room where the lord or lady sleeps. They're trusted with this responsibility because they've usually served the family for years or decades, because their loyalty has been tested repeatedly, and because frankly, if they wanted to kill you, they've had dozens of better opportunities than locking themselves in a room with you and several witnesses. Some households took this even further. One household record from Scotland describes a practice where the chamberlain, after locking the door, would sleep directly in front of it, literally blocking the entrance with their body. This served two purposes. Anyone trying to enter would have to step over or move the chamberlain, waking them in the process. And it demonstrated the chamberlain's commitment to protecting the household, willingly placing themselves between potential threats and the sleeping noble. After locking the door, the chamberlain makes one final circuit of the room, checking that all candles except those deemed necessary are extinguished, that the fire is at appropriate levels, that the window shutters are still secure, that everything is as it should be. This final inspection takes only a minute or two, but it's the last official duty before the household transitions from preparing for sleep to actually sleeping. The chamberlain then retires to their designated position, usually a pallet or simple bed in a corner of the room, or sometimes in a small antechamber connected to the main sleeping chamber. They don't fully undress or get comfortable. They remain in a state of semi-readiness, able to wake quickly if needed, able to respond to any crisis that might occur during the night. The count is complete, the number is recorded, the door is locked. Everyone present is accounted for and sealed inside together until dawn. You're in a stone box with a controlled number of people, most of whom you trust, some of whom are paid to stay awake and watch for threats, both natural and supernatural. It's finally, truly, actually bedtime. The fire crackles. Someone snores softly, might be one of the dogs, might be the firekeeper dozing between log additions. The chamber breathes with the collective presence of sleeping and half-sleeping bodies. You drift toward unconsciousness, knowing that in approximately 8 to 10 hours this entire process will reverse. Someone will unlock the door. The final head count will be compared to the initial head count. Servants will file out. You'll wake up and the cycle will begin again. But for now, sleep. Finally, mercifully sleep. You're asleep now. Finally, after approximately 3 hours of ritual blessing, counting, touching, arranging, and being attended by what feels like the entire population of a small village. Your dreams, whatever they are being monitored by an interpreter who's already planning how to connect your subconscious imagery to your waking concerns. The firekeeper is awake, watching flames and occasionally prodding logs while fighting their own exhaustion. The dogs are snoring in their assigned positions. The chamber is dark except for the low glow of the hearth and maybe one guttering candle that hasn't quite burned out yet. But here's the thing about this entire elaborate ritual we've just spent thousands of words exploring. You have to do it again tomorrow, and the day after that, and every single day for the rest of your life. There's no vacation from bedtime ceremony. There's no, let's skip it tonight, I'm too tired. This is your life now. Bathing schedules, blessing protocols, dog hierarchies, iron placement head counts and locked doors every single night until you die. And when you die, your children will inherit these rituals and probably add a few more, because medieval nobility never met a simple process they couldn't make more complicated. That's the morning dread, the knowledge, even as you sleep, that when you wake up the unlocking will happen in reverse. The Chamberlain will count everyone again, confirming that the number of souls present at dawn matches the number locked in at night. Any discrepancy would trigger an investigation, accusations, possibly violence. But assuming everyone's still accounted for, the door will be unlocked, the shutters will be opened with their own ritual knocking and prayers, and servants will begin flooding in to help you dress, which requires almost as much ceremony as undressing did. The dream interpreter will request an audience to discuss your night visions. You'll have to remember what you dreamed or make something up if you don't, because saying, "I didn't dream anything," sometimes worried medieval physicians who believed dreamless sleep indicated spiritual emptiness or dying humours, so you'll describe something, anything, and the interpreter will connect it to what you told them the previous night, finding meanings and warnings and prophecies in the random neural firing of your sleeping brain. The firekeeper, if they've successfully stayed awake all night, will report on the night's fire management, how many logs were used, any unusual behaviour from the flames, whether they detected any signs of demonic presence. If they fell asleep at their post, they'll lie about it, and everyone will pretend to believe them, because replacing a firekeeper is annoying, and training a new one takes months. Your dogs will need to be taken out, fed and prepared for another day of following you around the castle. The bed linens will be inspected for any signs of illness, night sweats, or other symptoms that medieval physicians found diagnostically significant. Your chamber pot or garderobe will be emptied and examined by whoever drew that unfortunate duty, and a report will be made to the household physician about the state of your digestion, because apparently nobles couldn't even use the bathroom without it becoming a medical consultation. And tonight, you'll do it all again. The bell will ring, the procession will form, you'll bathe, be blessed, be dressed, touch your saint bone, brief the dream interpreter, count the servants, and lock yourself in a room with dogs and iron and red thread and burning logs, tended by someone who probably wishes they'd chosen a different career. Historians sometimes wonder why medieval nobles died young despite having access to the best food, the finest physicians, and lives of relative leisure. But when you consider the sheer stress of maintaining these nightly rituals, the performance anxiety of having servants witness every aspect of your existence, the paranoia about demons and witches and poisoners, the complete absence of privacy, the knowledge that your every action is being observed, recorded and judged. Maybe it's surprising they lived as long as they did. Some nobles probably loved these rituals. The structure, the predictability, the reassurance of repetition. Maybe it was comforting to know that every night followed the same pattern, that you were protected by the same blessings and barriers your ancestors used, that you were never truly alone, even in sleep. For people living in an uncertain world where disease and war and random catastrophe could strike without warning, maybe elaborate bedtime rituals provided psychological security worth the inconvenience. Other nobles probably hated it, felt suffocated by the constant attendance, longed for privacy, resented the time and energy spent on ceremonies that might or might not have any actual protective value. But there was no opting out. You were born into this system, you participated in it, and you die in it, probably in the same bed where servants have been warming your sheets for 50 years. The morning dread isn't fear of waking up, it's the knowledge of what waking up means. Another day of ceremony, another evening of preparation, another night of being counted locked in and surrounded by people whose job is to keep you alive, but whose constant presence sometimes makes you wonder if survival is worth this price. But you'll do it anyway, because you're a noble, because this is what nobles do, because your entire identity is built on maintaining these distinctions between yourself and common people. And if you gave up the rituals, what would you have left? Just wealth and power, which are boring without ceremony to make them meaningful. The fire burns lower, Dawn is still hours away. You sleep or try to sleep in your warm bed surrounded by cold walls, protected by iron and prayer, watched by servants who are paid to care whether you survive until morning. And tomorrow night the bell will ring again, the procession will form again, the dogs will take their positions again, the chamber will be counted, blessed and locked again, forever or at least until you die, and someone else inherits your bed, your rituals and your noble burden of never being allowed to simply fall asleep like a normal person. The firekeeper adds another log. The flames rise briefly, then settle back to their steady glow. Somewhere in the castle a dog barks. Another servant begins their night shift. The world outside your locked chamber continues its slow rotation toward morning. You sleep protected by everything medieval paranoia could devise, surrounded by everything medieval wealth could provide, and trapped in a system of your own making that you can neither escape nor significantly change. Sleep well, noble lord, noble lady. Tomorrow begins the same way. Yesterday ended with a bell, a ritual, and the endless performance of being important enough to require 3 hours of preparation just to lie down. And so we reach the end of another night in a medieval castle, though really it's never truly the end, just a pause before the cycle begins again. You've journeyed through baths and blessings, through dog arrangements and dream briefings, through locks and head counts and the bizarre intimacy of being constantly observed, while trying to do something as simple as sleep. Perhaps you're lying in your own bed now, in your own time, with electric lights. You can turn off with a switch with privacy. You take for granted with the freedom to simply close your eyes, without blessing your linens or counting your servants, or worrying about night-flying witches. The medieval nobles whose rituals we've explored tonight would probably envy you. Or maybe they'd pity you sleeping alone in the dark, without servants to warm your bed, without dogs to guard your rest, without iron arranged in protective patterns. Different eras, different anxieties, different definitions of safety and comfort. The firekeeper in our story keeps watching through the night. The chamberlain sleeps lightly by the locked door. The dogs dream their dog dreams. And somewhere in the darkness a noble breathes slowly, finally at rest, after the longest bedtime routine in human history. Let their elaborate sleep rituals lull you into your own rest now. Let the absurdity of it all remind you that humans have always been strange, anxious creatures trying to make sense of darkness and vulnerability, creating meaning through ceremony especially when that ceremony becomes ridiculous. The night deepens, the castle sleeps, history fades into comfortable shadow, and you can simply close your eyes. No rituals required, no servants necessary. No dogs mandatory, though they're welcome if you have them. Just sleep. Simple, blessed, unremarkable sleep. Good night. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.